Hey, this is Dina. You finally got me to talk about the Silent Hill movie. I hope you're happy. But in all seriousness, since I am a Silent Hill fan, I have been making videos about that series for years, and how I'm rather opinionated about the series overall. It's only natural that people have been wanting me to do a review of some kind of the movie. The problem with the Silent Hill movie is that it's oddly controversial. It's like you have people who love it, people who hate it, and when they get together, bad stuff happens. And I have to admit, sometimes when I've tried to talk about what I dislike about the movie, I feel like Dib in this scene.
We've been passing the same stuff over and over again. Look at that dog! That dog's gone by 4, maybe 5 times already!
What's wrong with the dog?
Yeah, I like the dog.
So why am I talking about it now? Well, I guess some part of me has always wanted to give my official 2 cents on this rather than just taking little jabs at it in my other videos. Also, not too long ago, I caught an episode of Atop the Fourth Wall, where Linkara talked about the 15 things that are wrong with Identity Crisis, because apparently it's a comic book series that a lot of people like, and rather than try to change anyone's opinions, because he knew he couldn't, he just wanted to state his case about what he thought was wrong with it, and basically lay his cards on the table. And that got me thinking about the Silent Hill movie and how I feel kind of similarly about it, and I figured this was a good way to approach it. I really don't want to go through and cover the whole movie. It's been done, and oh hell, I just didn't want to do it, okay? So I'm just taking all the rants I probably would have made and condensing them into 5 major problems I had with the movie. Just one of these things by itself might not have been a deal breaker, but all together they form a perfect storm of suckitude, in my opinion. Now, believe it or not, I do get why some of you like this movie. It looks good, it's dark, it's scary and intense, at least on the first viewing. The special effects are ridiculously good, and it does have cool little moments here and there. I like the use of the orange lighting to remind us of fire, and the music could not have been better. And this is not me trying to change anyone's mind. I'm mainly just laying all my cards out on the table and answering the question a lot of people ask me, just why do you hate the Silent Hill movie so much? Well, here you go, the top 5 things I hate about the Silent Hill movie. And I know you may be thinking, what, only 5? Well, they are 5 big things, and they are things I have a lot to say about.
Number 5.
I'm still debating with myself about whether this one should be higher on the list, but I guess I look at it this way. Homecoming is about as subtle as a kick to the head.
You gotta be shitting me.
But I do still generally like the story, and I care about the characters, so I guess I can accept a lack of subtlety in a Silent Hill story. It's not a good thing, but it's something that I can overlook if other aspects are good or at least compelling enough to make up for it. That said, one of the best aspects about the Silent Hill series overall is that it takes a less is more approach to storytelling, and usually doesn't show you more than you need to see or tell you more than you need to know about what's going on, and it lets you mentally fill in the gaps and figure things out for yourself. Now, of course, there are exceptions here and there, even outside Homecoming, but generally the series does not hold your hand and walk you through the story, and it doesn't tend to revel in being super graphic. As for the movie, first let's start with the gore. With people being reduced to bloody hamburger by barbed wire, a flashback showing Alessa's nude body being suspended over flaming coals. I know it's not all that graphic, but they do still essentially show a 10-year-old child being cooked alive, not to mention her charred remains directly afterwards. The close-up on Sybil's face showing the skin boiling off as she gets the same treatment. And of course, Pyramid Head flaying someone and then throwing her skin at the freaking gate, which is gruesome to the point of being hilarious. This movie is just way more graphic than it needs to be. Because, seriously, where did all this come from? Remember, the Silent Hill movie came out after Silent Hill 4. When did we see anything like this in those games? Especially in the first one. You know, the game the movie's supposed to be based on? Oh sure, there was gore in the form of lots of blood everywhere and icky corpses, because that's how Alessa's poor traumatized mind saw the world after she was burned. We didn't see her being burned. We didn't have to. We get why being burned alive is a horrible thing to have happen to you. We don't need to have it shown to us for what probably adds up to about a minute. We're not stupid. And even though Pyramid Head being a monster rapist in Silent Hill 2 has become something of an inside joke among the fans, even those scenes aren't exactly graphic, and in the case of the first instance, it goes by pretty quick. First time I played the game, I couldn't even tell what he was doing. In any case, we didn't need to see him rip anyone's skin off to know that he's dangerous. They also try to over-explain how and why things happen. Having a parent taking their kid to a resort town is enough. We need to be shown that the kid is having nightmares and conveniently yelling out the name of the town. And have the parent decide that it's a good idea to take her there. The echo of crying in a bathroom. We couldn't just be left to put two and two together and figure out that Alessa went to the bathroom to cry because the other kids were making fun of her. That's not enough of an explanation. It's gotta be because something bad happened to her in there, which turns out to be that she was raped by a janitor. We can't just assume that the snow is snow. It's gotta be ash from an underground fire that's still burning. Although the movie doesn't make it quite clear where it came from, I'll get to that and some other stuff later. And don't even get me started on this little monologue.
Congratulations, Rose. You're here. You did it. Your reward is exposition.
One of this movie's biggest flaws as an adaptation of Silent Hill, if not a movie, is that it throws subtlety out the window in favor of just shoving everything in your face as if you're too dumb to figure out what's going on unless they do. This is not what Silent Hill is about.
Number 4.
This one particularly bugs me because while the movie goes out of its way to be different from the first game, mostly to its own detriment, it simultaneously puts these silly little nods to the game as if throwing us a bone. It feels kinda condescending to me. It's like, yeah, sorry, no Harry Mason, but look at Rose! Doesn't she totally look like a more grown-up Heather? See, we know our stuff! And there's a scene where Rose is in a car in the rain while Letter from Lost Days is playing on the radio, which is supposed to remind us of the scene in Silent Hill 3 where that song plays in Douglas's car in the rain. The thing is, Letter from Lost Days is about a woman looking back on her childhood and contemplating if she grew up to be as happy as she always hoped she'd be when she was a little girl. And because it's playing while Heather mourns the death of her father, it's just so deep and poignant, I can get choked up just thinking about it. It just does not have the same impact in this scene where Rose has been pulled over by a cop and she's contemplating gunning it. If they were smart, they would have saved it for a possible sequel, but instead they chose to try to cram as much of the first 4 games into the movie as they could, so I guess there won't be any attempt to replicate this scene in Silent Hill Revelations 3D. Then again, they're using the same nurses in Pyramid Head again, so who knows. Speaking of which, you knew it was coming. Pyramid Head is probably the biggest and most blatant aspect of Silent Hill lore to be thrown into this movie completely out of context. Granted, he doesn't have a whole lot of screen time, but that almost makes it worse in a way. Pyramid Head used to be something unique. He used to symbolize something. Now he's just one more reused monster among many in this movie and the 2 following games. And I know some people like the refurbished theory of Pyramid Head as a symbol of guilt, revenge, justice, whatever, to explain why he's in this movie and the later games, but the Book of Lost Memories states, in reference to whether or not Pyramid Head was the quote-unquote Red Devil seen by Walter Sullivan, that only James Sunderland in Silent Hill 2 can see Pyramid Head. He was supposed to have been James's personal demons given a solid form. And some people like to argue that the movie takes place in its own continuity, so it's okay for Pyramid Head to be there. And I guess I can't technically argue with that, but if nothing else, his appearance in the movie opened the door for him showing up in later games, and that is something I am not okay with and never will be. You cannot allow a Bible of your series to be published and then turn right around and try to retcon something in it. And don't get me wrong, there are some nods to various games that I don't mind, and if the movie had stayed close to the plot of the first game and just kinda added some nods to the sequels as extras, I would have been fine with that. But instead, they end up taking important characters and plot points and throwing them in as Easter eggs instead of staying true to the source material, and taking a lot of this stuff out of context makes it meaningless. I'm especially annoyed with Lisa's role being reduced to a cameo that involves something happening to her that only vaguely resembles what happened in the game. And again, taken totally out of context and pretty much rendered meaningless. It'd be like if they left Judd Crandall out of Pet Sematary but still had some random old man wave at Lewis from across the street in one scene as a nod to it. I didn't want this stuff left out, but if you're gonna do it anyway, just leave it out. Don't try to make up for it like this. It just feels condescending. And I know the director is a Silent Hill fan, and I'm sure the real reason he put this stuff in is because he loves it and he just couldn't resist. Unfortunately, it doesn't tend to come across that way. At least not to me.
Number 3.
So, they adapted a story and changed the main character pretty much completely, including the gender.
The lead character of Silent Hill 1 is a man named Harry Mason, and he worked very well in the game. But when we start to write him, respecting his personality, we found that it's a woman.
He elaborates on it in this article. We realized after 2 weeks in the writing process that Harry was actually motivated by feminine, almost maternal feelings. To be true to the character, it was very odd and difficult to write for him. He worked fine in the game, but as a real actor, it was too strange. It's not that he's effeminate, but he's acting like a woman. Gee, it sounds an awful lot like you're saying that a father wouldn't have it in him to want to track down and save his daughter. And I'm sorry, how exactly does Harry act like a woman? He takes charge of his situation as much as he can, he's protective of his daughter, he's protective of the 2 women he meets. I personally believe that's partly because he's a widower. In any case, he's very protective of the women in his life. I'd say that's a masculine trait. Hell, as of Silent Hill 3, he went all commando on a cult member to protect Heather at one point. If anything, I'd say he's a pretty damn good male role model. I know he's a bit bland in the first game, but he could have easily been made into a great character. I know people love the complexity of James Sunderland, and I do too, but there's just something so warm and appealing about Harry Mason, at least as a concept. It's like if James is Batman, then Harry is Superman. One is dark and complex and easy to be fascinated with, and it's easy to see why he's popular. The other is a lot more simple and straightforward, but you can't help but love him if only for the ideals that he represents. As if our culture doesn't downplay the importance of fatherhood enough already, someone has to come along and basically go, all those positive traits? Psh, father wouldn't do any of that. Make it a mother. That's believable. I love Harry Mason, and I would have wanted to see him portrayed in this movie, but I'm not sure if his absence bothers me half as much as the reasoning for it. I'm sorry, but where I come from, we call that sexism. Oh well. Just makes me love Shattered Memories that much more, I guess. It'll be interesting to see if they make up for this in Revelation, since it appears that Sean Bean's character is more or less morphed into Harry Mason. And he does resemble Harry from Shattered Memories, so that's kind of interesting.
Number 2.
It goes without saying that a movie adaptation of anything is going to make some changes. This one is an extreme case as it is, but what bothers me the most is that they picked such a cliché and overused plot point to change it to. In the original game, Dahlia had Alessa burned alive and put into a coma because she was meant to give birth to an evil god and her suffering would feed and nurture it. Claudia's monologuing in Silent Hill 3 helps to flesh it out a little bit. In the movie, Alessa is accused of being a witch because, and this is the only reason given, no one knows who her father is and so they got a craving for baked Alessa. Yeah, really. A witch burning. In the 1970s. By what has got to be the most puritanical cult in history. So I have a problem with this for many reasons. First of all, yes, people were tried and convicted of witchcraft in the past. The thing is, this was centuries ago, and it's something we tend to look back on with bafflement because it's just so damn irrational. All I'm saying is that if your story involves a witch burning and it doesn't take place in the 1600s, we're gonna need a little more convincing than, oh, she didn't have a dad or something. Anyway, back to how mean they were, those big meanies. It's cliche, but it can technically be pulled off. It's just gotta have some thought put into it. There's gotta be a reason why a large group of people is going to be this irrational.
Oh, you can't be serious.
Take Gingerbread, a season 3 episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, for example. Buffy's mom goes out on patrol with her where she finds 2 dead children whose deaths are believed to be occult-related. She tells everyone in town about it and starts an organization to fight the occult, which turns out to include Buffy and her friends who are witches. Buffy begins to put 2 and 2 together when she realizes that nothing is known about the 2 children other than their deaths. It turns out that these exact same children are found murdered every 50 years dating back to the 1600s. They inspired the story of Hansel and Gretel and set off the Salem witch trials. It turns out to be a demon who takes the form of these 2 children.
Some demons thrive by fostering hatred and persecution amongst the mortal animals. Not by destroying men, but by watching men destroy each other.
And of course all this leads up to the witch burning scene. All this is pretty cleverly put together. Not only do we get ample reason how the situation escalated to a witch burning, but it's even linked to the Salem witch trials, which helps to kind of ground it in reality a little bit. It also doesn't hurt that Buffy is a show that tends to be very tongue-in-cheek, so it can generally get away with a lot.
Did I get it?
We're here to save you.
Here's another example. The Season 1 episode of the Dead Zone series called Here There Be Monsters. Psychic Johnny Smith is traveling through the small town of Hobbs Landing, Massachusetts, on his way home from having his head checked, when he runs into a police officer who mentions that there's an ongoing murder case.
A double homicide last night. Mother and her 8-year-old daughter, out in the woods. Second daughter still missing. 13 years old.
Well, my friend he's helped the police up in Maine every now and then.
The cops do not believe that he is psychic. Instead, they think he's the murderer since he knows too much about the crime. So they decide to keep him on a bogus charge to buy them enough time to figure out how he did it.
Violation of Local Ordinance 65. Practice of witchcraft.
Johnny is, of course, found not guilty of practicing witchcraft. But meanwhile, the townspeople are really jittery about Johnny. This is a very small town where everybody knows everybody, and they're all very torn up about the murders of this mother and daughter and the missing second daughter. And once Johnny discovers that the missing girl is still alive and the police are told where to look, the townspeople just snap and the witch hunt ensues. I'm not going to give away the ending to this one because it's a great twist. You'll have to look it up and watch it yourself. But this is another good example of that whole burn the witch trope being handled well. There's less of an explanation than in Gingerbread, but it's set up in such a way that it makes sense. No one actually believes Johnny is a witch, despite his psychic power being a logical reason as to why they could. This scene where Johnny is tied to a stake and they get set to burn him alive is actually an interrogation scene, and because the murders were satanic in nature, to them this is probably poetic justice. The Dead Zone is really good at taking a plot that is kind of cliche and making it work. It's currently on Netflix Instant, by the way, so if you want to watch it... But I digress. As for the Silent Hill movie, well, they do show that the cult has a bit of an obsession with burning people as witches, so it's not like Unless It's Fate just kind of happens completely out of nowhere. But then again, there's no real reason given except that it's just something they do, and in the 1970s, I just don't buy it. It just didn't have enough setup to make it believable, in my opinion. In the games, it's mentioned that Alessa had powers of some kind. In the movie, she has no powers, and yet somehow is believed to be a witch. What?
Number 1.
The complaint I hear from supporters of this movie a lot is, oh, people just went in with unrealistic expectations. They're just mad because it's not exactly like the game down to the smallest detail. Well, that's an unfair assumption. I actually went into this movie knowing that they replaced Harry with Rose, and I figured it probably wouldn't follow the game's plot too closely. I was actually not the serious fan I am now, and even though I thought it was an odd choice, I was okay with it, or at least willing to give it a chance. Even now, I wouldn't have minded if they just forewent the plot of the game completely and did their own entirely original story with their own monster designs the way some of the more inventive fanfic writers have done. Or they could even have done a prequel of some kind, fleshing out some aspect of the town's history. So no. I mean, I definitely would have wanted to see an adaptation of the first game, but the movie didn't have to be that as far as I'm concerned. My main problem with this movie is that even as a standalone movie, it's just not that good. The characters are stupid and act irrationally, and the story is a big convoluted mess, which is weird because usually movie adaptations leave things out. This one did leave things out, but I think it added more than it removed, partly because it's always trying to explain things it didn't need explaining. Really, the game's story was a lot more straightforward. It starts off with a child sleepwalking dangerously close to the edge of a cliff, and it's made clear that this has happened many times before. If you have a child who's known to sleepwalk, why the hell do you live so close to a cliff? I'm just gonna gloss over how convenient it is as she screams "Silent Hill!" with perfect clarity and skip to the mom taking her there despite the fact that the daughter is obviously terrified of it. It's apparently illegal to go there and the air is toxic. Not to mention that she runs away from a police officer in the process like that's not gonna come back and bite her later. Now, what is so wrong with having the movie start off with them just about to visit what they think is a normal resort town, like in the game, and just skip all that nonsense? Here's another thing, the snow being ash. When I first saw this movie, I thought that was kind of cool. It made me think of Schindler's List. Problem is that the movie doesn't make it very clear where the ash comes from. Well, I think we're supposed to believe it happened when they burned Alessa, because we do see the burning coals spill onto the floor, and there's a big gaping hole there afterwards. Not sure how realistic that is. Plus, we never see any ash coming out from that hole. Also, since it's inspired by the real abandoned town of Centralia, which has a coal mine fire, I think a lot of people assume that that's all it is. Yeah, I don't know why they didn't just base it off of, oh, I don't know, the town of Silent Hill, but whatever. I could shrug it off as not really coming from anywhere in particular and just being symbolic, except that it's in the real world too. It's a neat idea in theory, and it's probably just meant to add to the theme of fire that this movie has, along with the orange lighting and the enemies burning up. Unfortunately, it's just unnecessary, and in the end it only causes confusion. I already mentioned this one, but it bears repeating. Alessa being raped or at least molested by a janitor. Again, they're trying to add explanation to something that didn't need it, but also there's some wonky logic at work here. At what school would they have a male janitor in the girls' restroom during school hours? Especially one run by a cult that's so puritanical they scream, "Burn the witch!" over a child not having a known father? I've already talked about the witch burning angle and why that doesn't work, so I won't go into that again. Here's another one. Sybil murdering herself just pisses me right off. There is no damn reason for it, for one thing. What she does right here, she could have done just as easily from inside the elevator with Rose. It could be that she figures that if they're busy killing her, they'll forget about Rose long enough for her to rescue her kid. But obviously that doesn't work out. Speaking of which, I was annoyed enough when she appeared to be beaten to death in this scene, but then when she wakes up tied to a ladder, I thought to myself, hey, Sybil is still alive. That must mean she's gonna get rescued. Nope. Cue gory death scene. It's like she gets killed off twice. It's just frustrating because Sybil is about the only character in this movie who appears to actually have a few working brain cells most of the time. Then someone hands her the idiot ball and that's that. By the way, I love this one cultist who literally points and laughs. It's like, hey, your face is on fire. Which brings us to the cultists wanting to burn Sharon too because that worked so well for them the first time. Then of course there are all the scenes with the poor husband and father where he basically discovers things just after Rose does, but like, less so. It's like Rose takes Sharon to Silent Hill. Chris finds out Rose is missing and he goes looking for her in Silent Hill. Rose discovers that Alessa has something to do with Sharon. Chris finds a picture of a girl who looks like Sharon. Rose finds out what happened to Alessa. Chris discovers that something bad happened at some point in the town's history. Rose rescues Sharon and they leave the town, although not really. Chris is made to go home. And it's all completely pointless. Apparently the Christopher scenes were added due to executive meddling because the movie would have had an all-female cast otherwise. And I can kind of understand why. Most people who watch horror movies are teenage and college-age guys who would not really be able to relate to a female character. Or at least this is probably how the studio saw it. I'm all for girl power, but I think Gans should have had the forethought to see this coming, and just made a male and female lead like the game did. So am I saying the movie would have been better if they had stuck to the original story? Not necessarily. They could have found some other way to screw it up, but it probably would have been easier to avoid having the story end up such a convoluted mess. Because really, as Silent Hill games go at least, the first game's story is fairly straightforward. Certainly a lot more straightforward than this movie is. If you were to take out most of the boss fights and puzzles, and maybe have fewer locations so there isn't too much time wasted with having Harry run from one building to the next, but keep the story pretty much intact, you would have a nice creepy little tale about a father and how he's willing to go to hell and back for his little girl. He meets two women along the way, one he's able to save, the other he isn't. Or hell, maybe neither. I could deal with Sybil being killed off as long as it's handled well. And in the end, evil is defeated, but the ending would be bittersweet. It would have been faithful to the game, which could have made fans like me happy. There would have been enough disturbing stuff to keep horror fans happy, and yet it would have been unique enough compared to other mainstream horror movies that it might have even pleased newcomers, maybe even critics. Again, I'm not saying that following the game closely would automatically make a good movie. I'm just saying it could have worked, and it would have been interesting to see that attempted. It's not like the Silent Hill movie was all bad. The monsters look fantastic, partly because they were done with actors in costumes and practical effects instead of CG whenever possible, which is almost always a good thing, as I've said before. The locations look great, there's a lot of detail put into them. A few scenes are shot-for-shot remakes of their game counterparts, which is pretty cool, if only from a technical standpoint. The transition to the other world, and really the other world in general, looks amazing, and that transition animation is something from the movie that I did not mind making it into later games. Even though I'm not crazy about a lot of the characters in this movie, I do think that the actors did a good job with what they were given. They even did most of their own stunts, which is pretty damn impressive, and looking at the making of videos, it looks like everyone involved had a blast making this movie. So I guess you could say I've developed a kind of an appreciation for the Silent Hill movie, just for the aspects that I just stated. I can understand people putting on this movie and turning their brain off just to appreciate seeing the Silent Hill world brought to life. But at the same time, that just makes it harder to bear. It's hard not to think if only this kind of love and care had been put into making an accurate adaptation of Silent Hill, if the director just hadn't tried to make it his own as much as he did, or at least was smarter about it, it could have been awesome. At this point, I've pretty much come to terms with my hatred of this movie. I don't like it, but this is what we got, and it is what it is. And of course, we've got a sequel coming out, which is supposed to follow Silent Hill 3 along with being a continuation of the first movie. At the time I'm making this video, it has not come out yet, but from what I've seen, it could easily go either way as far as making things better or worse in the Silent Hill movie adaptation department. I've seen some things that look promising, but I've seen just as many things that make me scratch my head and wonder what the hell the new director is smoking, so we'll just have to see how it goes. Well, that about wraps up the 5 major problems I have with the Silent Hill movie. There's probably more I could have mentioned, but I didn't want to be here all day. Well, that's it for now. See you next time.
Congratulations, Rose. You're here. You did it. Your reward is
a new car!
Hey, this is Dina. Welcome to the Den. And oh my god, this is the timeliest Silent Hill episode I've done so far. Silent Hill Downpour only came out last year. It's fine with me though. It's a Silent Hill game and I'd rather give it a while to sink in, play it multiple times, and do a little research and make sure I understand it as well as possible and make a well thought out retrospective, than to rush out a quick video based on my first impressions only to change my mind about the game later. Because, seriously, with a Silent Hill game, that can happen. My experience with this game was pretty similar to my experience with Shattered Memories, where I was very apprehensive about it at first. It was developed by a company I'd never heard of, Vatra Games, and there was no involvement by Akira Yamaoka, which was a first for the series. I even temporarily passed it up in favor of Silent Hill HD Collection because Konami made the brilliant decision to release them both in the same month, along with Book of Memories, but the less said about that the better. Incidentally, before anyone asks, no, I don't plan on covering Book of Memories. I just don't really care about it, and even if I did, I don't even have a PS Vita, so I couldn't play it if I wanted to. Plan is the key word there. I'm wording it carefully this time because you never know, but I digress. What it comes down to is that because I had my reservations about Downpour, I ended up playing it safe and getting HD Collection instead, since I already knew I liked the games that were on it. I also had a minor role in getting the original voices for Silent Hill 2 put back in.
How can you sit there eating pizza? This town is full of monsters.
And I was very glad that Konami relented and added the voice track that I wanted to speak with my pocketbook. Unfortunately, I had no idea how buggy it would be, but that's a rant for another video. In short, I could only afford one game at the time both games were out, so I got HD Collection instead of Downpour, which I ended up regretting later. I ended up loving Downpour, not as much as Shattered Memories, but it's at least an improvement over Homecoming and Origins, whatever that's worth to you. You play as Murphy Pendleton, a prison inmate who's being transferred from one prison to another. The bus crashes in Silent Hill and, well...
This is Silent Hill.
So you can probably guess where this is going. And in typical Silent Hill fashion, you eventually learn about his past and why he's there. It borrows some concepts from Silent Hill 2, but not to the point that it feels like a ripoff or anything. Yes, I am okay with this. It's just how the series has evolved, and as long as I'm not seeing freaking Pyramid Head, or sexy faceless nurses, or anything equally blatant and unimaginative, I'm at least open to the idea. More on that later. Like Silent Hill 2, one of the people you meet there gives you some insight into Murphy, as in he has something in common with Murphy. This kind of reminds me of Eddie and Angela in Silent Hill 2. And like in Silent Hill 3, another character you meet is a direct link to Murphy's past, kind of like Claudia Wolf. Although maybe more similar to Laura from Silent Hill 2. One thing that's kind of unique to this game is that there are a couple of other characters who are stuck in Silent Hill just as Murphy is, and their only link to him is that the town is basically using them to help or hinder Murphy. Nothing else about them is revealed. Not sure how I feel about that, but I have to admit that the idea of the town using people to its own ends in this way is pretty interesting.
That's the spirit. Whatever.
Gameplay is fairly run-of-the-mill for survival horror. Melee weapons are breakable, and you can throw them like in Origins, but it's a lot less silly looking because you aren't going around beaming monsters with one of the 15 toasters you're carrying around with you somehow. In fact, aside from your firearm, you can only hold one weapon at once, which sounds like a huge hindrance, but considering that you're surrounded by potential weapons at any given time, it's really not a problem, so you may end up chucking bricks at monsters instead. There are also a few points in the game where Murphy will lose all of his weapons, so don't bother holding back using the ammo. Use it while you can, basically. Yeah, it sucks that you end up losing your firearms, but it generally doesn't take long to find new ones.
That's more like it.
Seems like a fair trade to me. It's also not overly fight strategy oriented like Homecoming, which was a big relief for me. I can generally get by with button mashing like in earlier games, so yay, you don't have to be a hardcore gamer to play this one. I have no real qualms about the gameplay, but I have to say that it was kind of an odd decision to make the otherworld areas function the way they did in Shattered Memories, where you were constantly being pursued by something you couldn't fight and it was either run like hell or die instantly, more or less. And I am speaking as someone who loved Shattered Memories otherwise, but found the otherworld levels frustrating as hell. I was under the impression that a lot of other fans felt similarly. I'm just really surprised they brought that back. I'll be damned if I can figure out why. It's a good bit of symbolism, if kind of an obvious one. The void that's chasing you represents the truth, which Murphy is literally running from, and when it catches up to him, it destroys him. I caught on to that pretty much immediately.
Did you see that? That was cool! Do it again.
But once again, it's frustrating to get through, and you better hope Murphy doesn't get hung up on any corners. Happened to me a couple times. I'm not sure if it's a programming issue or if I just screwed up. Also, speaking of Shattered Memories, I had the same saving issue with this game that I had with that one, where it'll appear to have saved properly, I'll turn the game off, and then when I come back to it, I'll end up having lost 15 minutes of gameplay. Sometimes I'll end up having to sit through a cutscene a second time. Kind of weird since it's made by a different developer and it's on a totally different console. In my case, a different generation of console because I was playing Shattered Memories on the PlayStation 2. And while I'm on the subject of bugs, there's a visual one that I find kind of amusing. If you die and continue in some areas, there will appear to be double doors in some doorways, one of which Murphy can walk through. It doesn't bother me, I just think it's kind of amusing. Oh hey, I fixed it. Or not. Visuals are mostly really good. The backgrounds look great and are pretty interactive. Murphy tends to react to things around him. For example, if something falls in front of him suddenly, he'll flinch and let out a scream or an obscenity, or if the ground looks unstable, he'll tread slowly and carefully even if you're holding the run button. I kinda get a kick out of that. It's like I'm going, hurry up, and he's all, what are you, crazy? I guess what I'm getting at is that he's very animated. Even when you're not doing anything, he'll never just stand there. He'll constantly be looking around with caution. As well he should, considering he's in Silent Hill. Speaking of interacting with your environment, a lot of the stuff in Homecoming that I thought was cool, ducking under things and smashing through boarded up doorways with a pickaxe, has returned. Looked a bit cooler when Alex did it though. But you can break through padlocks with a wrench or similar weapon now. And you can also shatter glass, which is kind of fun, but not all the time. Also, I don't know how I got this far without talking about the weather system. As the title suggests, there's a lot of rain and thunder and lightning effects in this game, and it's pretty cool. I don't know if the hardware supports it realistically or not. When Murphy is wet from the rain, it's pretty convincing. His hair and clothes are darker, and his hair and skin is all glossy, but it happens fairly quick. In reality, it'd take a while for someone to look this drenched. It'd be nice if there were midpoints where he's just dotted with raindrops or something. I am being a bit picky, but since the game's weather system is its main gimmick, I figured it'd be appropriate to scrutinize it a bit. Also, the more time you spend outside, the harder it rains. And the harder it rains, the more the monsters come out and the stronger they are. So stay inside when you can. It's funny though, you can almost control the weather. You go inside for just a little while it's pouring, then go back outside and it's clear again for a while, but then it gradually gets bad again. Once again, the characters mostly look good. The character designs are great, but kinda like in Homecoming, there's a bit of uncanny valleyness going on with a couple of them. It's not as noticeable as Homecoming, but it's there. I also have a bit of a nitpick when it comes to animation and cutscenes. Characters move in a way that's kind of mechanical. It's a little rigid, and sometimes their faces appear frozen, or at least not as expressive as they should. It's not all the time with all characters either. It's just a recurring thing that I can't help but notice. Also, let's back up and talk about how Silent Hill developers don't know what children are supposed to look like, and Team Silent is more guilty of it than anyone. Cheryl just flat out had an adult face on a child's body, and it was creepy. Laura looked better, but still a little off. There's still something kind of adult about her face. They struck gold with Walter Sullivan. He is adorable and actually looks like a child. 3 following games handled it well too. And then we have Downpour. Charlie looks fine, thank God. Well, he looks a little like the love child of Macaulay Culkin and Crispin Glover, but that's okay, he's still cute. But there's a scene where you run across 2 other kids and, the boy is creepy as hell. And the girl's expressions are terrible. There's a scene where she screams in horror and her eyes are totally inexpressive and no one's mouth moves like this, okay? What's really bad, and I'm making it a point to avoid a really big spoiler at this point, is that it happens at the tail of a big reveal. It's this beautifully tragic scene that is so effective, and then they dissolve to this totally unconvincing shot. And it just kills it. But anyway, I didn't mean to get so ranty sounding. None of this stuff really ruins the game for me. But I do notice it, and I have to mention it so I'm not ignoring the elephant in the room. And to be fair, Vatra only has like 1 other game under their belt. I'm sure they did their best. Of course, one has to wonder why Konami would hand over one of their biggest franchises to an inexperienced company, but I don't want to open up that can of worms. But on the upside, a lot of creativity goes into locations. You get to go inside of a movie at one point. The fixed camera angles drive me nuts, but I have to give credit where it's due as far as creativity and visuals. Not that film grain effects in a Silent Hill game is anything new, but it's put to absolutely perfect use here. There's another area where you go onto a stage and through a brief maze of 2-dimensional props that look kind of like they were made by Frank Miller. Throwing you off guard with weird stuff like this is part of what makes a Silent Hill game, in my opinion. But one of my favorite locations to explore is the Centennial Building, specifically the library, because there are a lot of books on shelves where you can pick them up and read whatever spread they were previously open to. There are a lot of references to the history of crime and punishment, and one book talks about the works of Franz Kafka, specifically Metamorphosis and Into the Penal Colony. The description of the latter was interesting enough that I actually looked it up and read it. Anything that gets me to put down the controller and actually read something gets major props. I'll go more into the reading material later. But I also like the Centennial Building because it's just really vast and impressive looking, and it's where we're first introduced to one of the coolest enemies in the game, in my opinion. Speaking of which, remember how with Origins and Homecoming and the movie I complained about the monster designs being swiped from Silent Hill 2? Well, it's almost as if Konami listened, because other than Shattered Memories, this is the first Silent Hill game since like Silent Hill 4 to not have recycled monster designs.
It's working, it's working, it's working!
That said, unfortunately the monster designs overall aren't that great.
Woohoo! Fuck!
But it's not like they look bad or stupid or anything, or that they're not creepy looking. I think in general, the ones we see the most are just a little too humanoid, and it just feels like there could be a little more creativity put into it. Compared to Silent Hill 2, where early versions of the lying figures looked very humanoid, going as far as having boots and high heels and such, but instead of leaving it there, they pushed the envelope until what they ended up with was only vaguely humanoid, making the general look more interesting and the symbolism more subtle. I feel like maybe Downpour could have benefited from the developers taking a similar approach. I guess what I'm saying is that they're not up to the usual Silent Hill standards when it comes to deformity, I guess? But I cannot stress enough that I don't mean to nitpick, and in no way am I saying that this is a bad Silent Hill game. The last person I want to sound like is that guy who just bitches about a mostly good thing instead of enjoying those good aspects of it.
The pompous, know-all, know-nothing idiot who incidentally has a very small penis.
Yeah, him. I honestly do recommend Downpour. I feel that a Silent Hill game is successful as long as it's fun to play, the story is compelling, I feel for the main character, and whatever twists it throws in catch me off guard in a way that I don't expect, but that I can think back on it and connect the dots. And Downpour absolutely covers all those bases in my opinion. I just want people to realize going into it that it's not perfect, so maybe they won't have the impossibly high expectations that I feel a lot of Silent Hill fans have when playing a new Silent Hill game.
Never mind.
So as always, the following segments are going to contain serious spoilers, so if you haven't played Silent Hill Downpour yet, don't watch the rest of the videos after this one yet. Go play the game, then come back and watch the videos and we can compare notes. And yes, I am still using that clip from the Dead Zone series. I recommend that too. So as I said, the monster designs in this game aren't stellar, but the monsters themselves are worth talking about. I'm going to start with the one that I hate the most. Oh god, the screamers. I hate them. Did I say that already? I hate any kind of enemy that takes you out from a distance without warning, and basically they will do that. They have a scream attack that disorients you, and usually by the time I recover, the screamer in question is already on top of me. Maybe I'm just a shitty gamer. Well, of course I'm a shitty gamer, but my point is that maybe that's why they give me so much trouble. They basically resemble women with really big mouths and stretched out faces. Their hands are balled into fists with nails driven through them, and they use these as weapons. Honestly, their design doesn't do much for me. As I just explained, I get how they're supposed to look, but their hands kind of look like low poly claws or something. And there's something about their faces that make me think low poly too. I don't know, somehow their design just doesn't work for me. It's hard to explain. Looking at the early artwork, it looks like they were going to resemble normal women when not attacking. That would have been interesting to see them change like that. Speaking of which, the first time Murphy comes across one, she lures him close by sounding like a woman who is being mercilessly attacked by another inmate who also escaped from the crash.
Tell me something, puta. That true what I heard about you?
Maybe someday we'll get a Latin character in a Silent Hill game who isn't a stereotype.
I'll do a special favor for you later.
There's no official word that I know of on what the screamers represent, but the Silent Hill wiki suggests victims, with the screaming and torn clothing, or sirens, or Murphy's ex, which I'll go more into later. At least you get to operate on one. Murphy doesn't enjoy it much, but I do. Oh, weeping bats are a pain. Really strong, fast, and hard to kill. And they have an annoying habit of jumping up to the ceiling when you're about to deliver a blow. They also have a habit of startling the shit out of poor Murphy, which is kind of funny because the sudden appearance of the weeping bat doesn't startle me so much as Murphy yelling "fuck" or whatever. They show up in the Devil's Pit, and their saving grace is that once you're out of the Devil's Pit, you don't have to deal with them too much, other than the occasional straggler. Once you finally get to the point where you're not obsessively watching the ceiling anymore is usually when a damn weeping bat will show up again. Ugh! They resemble bats in their facial features, and as such, they represent solitary confinement. And they also look awesome, in my opinion. So these ones are really straightforward. They look like prisoners with the gang tattoos and such. They gang up on you and try to kick your ass, the way prisoners would. They're prisoners. See what I mean about some of the monster designs being kind of obvious? Which is not to say that they don't look pretty cool. They all have contraptions on their heads that hold their mouths open in an unnatural smile, and hold their eyes open meanwhile they're bleeding from this. That just looks really unpleasant. You know what? They kind of remind me of the insane children in American McGee's Alice. Minions come in two flavors, brawlers and stabbers. Plus there is a third who is a serious pain called Juggernaut. The good part is that you don't actually have to fight Juggernaut directly all that much. At least not at first. The game gives you other methods of dealing with them, like locking them up or, and this is the fun one, electrocuting the shit out of them. Bye! I'm gonna go out on a limb and theorize that they symbolize Murphy's fear of the other prisoners. Yeah, I know that's pretty out there. Apparently at one point they were going to look like clowns. I kinda have a love-hate relationship with this enemy. They are a serious pain, but I cannot deny how freaking cool they are. The doll itself doesn't attack you directly and doesn't even move. Instead, it sends copies of itself after you called shadows, which are nearly invisible unless you have your forensic flashlight turned on. Basically, attack the doll if you possibly can, and the shadows will die. But sometimes getting to it or even just figuring out where the hell it is can be more trouble than it's worth. They also cause serious problems in the Centennial building. Your first experience with them is that they cause a bridge to nearly collapse on you. And I know I said they don't move, and usually they don't, but sometimes you can catch a glimpse of one running around like in this scene. Either way, when you hear this laughter, be worried. They basically look like department store mannequins with a big gaping hole where the mouth would be, which has an uncanny valley kind of creepiness factor to it. They could symbolize Murphy's habit of attacking the symptom of a problem instead of the problem itself, with the doll being the main problem and the shadow being the symptom of said problem. They could also represent sexual repression, with Murphy being a prisoner and all. Because what's a Silent Hill protagonist without some good old sexual repression, am I right? I already talked about the void and how it symbolizes Murphy's desire to run away from the truth, but it could also symbolize his desire to punish and destroy himself because he is pretty racked with guilt. By the way, I love how it screams in rage whenever Murphy gets away from it for a while. I don't know why, I just get a kick out of it. While running from the void, you can knock down tormented souls in front of it to slow it down, much in the way that you could pull down objects and shattered memories to slow down your pursuers in that game. They resembled mangled humanoids who are suspended in a cage by their own flesh, and they perpetually twitch in agony. They represent those who suffered at the expense of the poor choices made by Murphy. They could also symbolize Murphy's own pain and isolation. Finally, we have wall corpses, which are more of an environmental obstacle than anything. But you do get to shoot them in the final level rather than only being able to dodge them, so that's kind of fun. They shoot what looks like blood, but appears to hurt you like acid out of their midsections. That's just gross. Once again, they symbolize imprisonment and pain. There are a few monsters that I haven't mentioned yet, but I couldn't talk about them without spoiling anything, plus some are linked with specific characters, and I wanted to talk about those characters first. You know, when you really break it down, there are a lot of characters in this game, but pretty much all are interesting and contribute to the story in some way or another, so it works out. Also, most of them either have only 1 or 2 scenes, or are only shown in flashbacks, so it doesn't make the same mistake that Homecoming and the movies make, as far as killing that feeling of isolation.
Look, I don't want any trouble. Just point the way out of town, and I'll keep right on going.
Now, who said anything about trouble?
The first new person Murphy meets in Silent Hill is a mail carrier named Howard Blackwood. Apparently he's a popular character because he also showed up in the comic book Past Life, no I haven't read it, and Book of Memories, whatever. He is kind of a fun character and one of the few in this game who is completely benevolent.
You scared the hell out of me.
Definitely not what I intended.
Couldn't dislike him if I tried. Murphy doesn't seem to quite trust him, not that he's in much of a position to trust anyone.
Name's Howard, by the way.
Murphy.
One has to wonder what he could have done to end up stuck in Silent Hill in what apparently is a loop of some kind. He seems way too friendly and passive to have done something to warrant an extended stay in Silent Hill. Whatever he did, this game does not reveal it. Apparently Book of Memories does, but I want to avoid spoilers of other games. Apparently he was Silent Hill's postmaster in the 19th century, so he's been there a while.
Well, let's just say I could finally put this damn bag down for starters.
He seems to regard Murphy with some sympathy, but also an air of, yeah, you're stuck here, just deal with it as best you can.
Do you understand me? Do ya?
Son, you still don't get it. It doesn't matter what you want.
He's one of the better designed characters in my opinion. He looks pretty realistic without reaching the uncanny valley.
I got mail to deliver. Goodbye, Murphy.
Flow on and on. It's always a perfect day with DJ Ricks, your on-air friend to the end.
Heidi-ho!
DJ Bobby Ricks is an example of what happens when you end up in Silent Hill and don't try to come to terms with whatever it is that brought you there. It's kind of interesting, actually. Think about if Harry or James just went and hid somewhere because the monster scared them too much, or Henry was afraid to go through that hole in his wall, so he just stayed in his apartment. Those games would have been very short and boring, but that's why DJ Bobby Ricks is not the main character of Downpour. Rather than go and face his problems, he holed himself up in the Centennial Building's radio station and called out to anyone who might be in the town who could help him. In fact, we're first introduced to him through the various radios Murphy comes across where he keeps getting dedications.
Speaking of which, this next one goes out to Murphy Pendleton, a lost soul on a stroll. You keep on keeping on, bro, and your pal DJ Ricks will do the same, playing the music y'all want to hear.
Eventually, Murphy finds his way to the top of the Centennial Building, where he finally confronts DJ Bobby Ricks in person, which is an interesting conversation.
Man, I came through hell and high water to get here because you called me. Now cut the bullshit, because I don't have time for this.
Thank God someone finally heard me. I can't even tell you how long it's been, just spinning record after record after record.
What's the plan?
Right. Listen, I got this boat. She's moored down at the marina. She's fast, real fast. Problem is some motherfucker ransacked the studio and checked the keys.
I'll hotwire it. No problem.
That's not gonna work. This place, it does strange shit to reality, man. It's like there's rules you gotta follow. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's called gameplay limitations. I get a kick out of that. It kind of reminds me of this bit from Silent Horror.
We've been out of here by now if we just busted in the door. You can't do that! Why not? You just can't.
Anyway, he actually knows a lot about how the town works and has a plan in mind, but doesn't have the courage to really use that knowledge to his advantage or try to make that plan come together on his own.
Yeah, sure. Who's it going out to? But that's nice of you to think of me.
Ooh, the next dedication was to him. How very Twilight Zone-y.
They're coming.
And that's the last we see of DJ Bobby Ricks. We never find out why he's in Silent Hill, who exactly those calls were coming from, or what ultimately happened to him. And I thought that was lazy storytelling at first, but the more I think about it, the more I'm okay with it. Not everything needs to be explained. In fact, as the movies have proven, it's sometimes better if it isn't. What's kind of unsettling is that anytime you turn on a radio after that point, this is what you hear. Poor DJ Bobby Ricks. And yes, I have to say his whole name every time. I just like to say it. DJ Bobby Ricks! I generally like his design, but as I showed earlier, his animation seems kind of robotic and he doesn't show much expression. It's not a big deal, but what can I say? I tend to notice these things.
What the hell's going on here, Ricks? What is this place?
No time to explain. If we're gonna get out of here, we gotta move fast. You getting this far tells me we might even have a chance of getting out alive.
First time visitor, huh?
Now, J.P. Sater, on the other hand, we do learn why he's in Silent Hill. He was a former tour guide of the Devil's Pit. He seems to still fancy himself as a tour guide, with how he likes to share facts about the attraction whenever he gets the chance.
Name's JP, and that, sir, is the Devil's Pit. 490 meters straight down to the blackest soul of the earth.
He's kind of a geek about it, really.
You know, they say if you were to put the Empire State Building in here, wouldn't even reach halfway to the top of this place.
Anyway, part of his job involved driving the mine's underground train, which transported passengers from the Devil's Pit to Hillside. And one day he was heavily intoxicated and the train ended up derailing, resulting in the deaths of 8 children. Also, you basically get to experience that ride, so imagine children dying this way, minus the monsters obviously. It's pretty messed up. Naturally, he lost his job, and that spelled the beginning of the end for J.P. Sater. He was deservedly blasted in the media, but he went into denial, claiming that it was just an accident and doesn't count as murder.
Those newspaper men are goddamn fucking liars.
Relax, man. We're just talking here.
What happened? That was an accident. I didn't mean to hurt nobody. I didn't murder nobody.
He also seems to know a lot about Murphy, despite Murphy not telling him anything, not even his name.
Ain't that right, Murphy? Surely your mama taught you about what's right and what's wrong.
It really reminds me of Eddie and Angela in Silent Hill 2, except it's a bit more blatant about it. Still unsettling, though. But he and Murphy share something in common, that they're both in denial about something they've done, albeit for different reasons.
And how about you, Murphy? Someone know all your dirty little secrets?
I never hurt anybody that didn't deserve it. And I sure as hell never hurt any kids.
The second time we meet JP, he's on a ledge, clearly contemplating jumping. You can choose to either console him or taunt him, which will affect what ending you get.
Just wait a second.
Is this a look of pity on JP's face?
He's seen you around, Murphy.
No! That's right. Take the easy way out. That's what cowards do, right?
Nothing easy about being a coward, Murphy. You ought to know that. Enjoy your stay.
Seems to be that he recognizes that Murphy's in denial just as he is and figures he'll suffer the same fate. Either way, JP ends up with the in-water ending. This is what happens when you face what brought you to Silent Hill and are unable to deal with it. Again, kind of like Angela. Also, at the end of the train ride, this happens. This guy, usually referred to as Monocle Man, is meant to represent J.P. Sater due to him being perceived as a monster either by himself or Murphy. That searchlight over the eye that looks like a monocle is meant to be reminiscent of that coin that J.P. is tossing when you first meet him. Also, this was originally going to be a boss fight complete with train-throwing tentacles, as revealed in an early trailer that was not supposed to have been released. No one knows why it was cut. It may have been due to an approaching deadline. Which is a shame, because he is so cool looking. And that whole theme with the train tracks is pretty cool too. He's so freaking big that his face is being held taut by multiple train tracks. I cannot overstate how awesome that is. But anyway, at least he wasn't cut completely, and we at least get a glimpse of him. Both JP's model and animation generally aren't that great, but I'd say that Monocle Man more than makes up for it.
Well, he's seen.
If you head through the cavern, there's a train. Can take you to Hillside. Boy, I tell you, all the kids, they just love that little train.
How about you show me?
Sorry. Someplace I gotta be.
So the way that we're introduced to our protagonist is interesting.
You don't recognize me, do you?
What? No, Guards! Anybody?
We used to be neighbors.
So, you know how video games tend to put you through a little tutorial in the beginning, like, fight this weak monster, we'll walk you through it. Silent Hill Downpour has you murder a totally defenseless guy. I fucking love that. So, the guy in question is Patrick Napier, former next-door neighbor to Murphy and his family. Yeah, you can probably guess where this backstory is going, and it isn't pretty. Speaking of not pretty, his death scene is about the most brutal and gritty death I've ever seen in a game. There's nothing clean or efficient or otherwise video game-like about it. It takes forever for this poor schmuck to die. He crawls away, and he goes out curled up screaming in a corner covered in his own blood.
Why?
Damn.
You know exactly why.
Napier was in jail for molesting and murdering an 8-year-old boy. He apparently has no regret about it and is downright smug until he realizes who he's trapped with. And even though this game's message is basically anti-revenge, I have to say I rather enjoy getting to kill this guy now that I know what he did. I guess if I want to be consistent, now's a point where I have to talk about whether or not his model and animation are convincing. I'm gonna go with too convincing. Knowing what this guy looks like, combined with what he did... I apologize for the mental images. Here, use some of this. It'll be okay.
This is a violation of my rights. Who the hell do you think you are? When I talk to the warden,
No one's listening.
Help! Jesus, help me!
So, of course, child molesters tend to be sequestered for their own protection because they don't last long in prison.
Can you believe that shit? For their safety. Let me ask you this. What about Charlie's safety, huh?
This is where this guy comes into play.
So, what do you say, Cupcake? You gonna play ball?
I'll take care of it.
Oh my god, what a bastard. And not the cute, lovable kind like Vincent.
What's wrong? You don't trust me?
I honestly wish I could reach through the screen and throttle this guy. I guess that's a sign of a good villain, but we're talking Percy Wetmore from the Green Mile levels of scumbag here. But I better back up. George Sewell is a corrections officer at Rial State Prison, and a very corrupt one at that. He tends to make deals with the prisoners, and those deals rarely work out in their favor. In Murphy's case, he would arrange for Murphy to have some alone time with Napier, and in return, Murphy would owe him an undisclosed favor.
Of course you can. I know you're a man of your word, Murphy. You be a straight shooter with me, I'll be a straight shooter with you.
Yeah, that'll end well.
Remember, Cupcake, you owe me one.
We'll get back to Sewell later, but I will say that the worst part is that aside from one ending, he basically gets off scot-free. Fuck you, Sewell! Oh yeah, his character model and such. It's technically good and does a great job of making me want to see Murphy punch him in the face. He even just looks like the kind of person you want to hit.
Come on, rise and shine, Cupcake, you know the drill. Guess today's a big day, huh? To tell you the truth, I'm sort of sorry to see you go.
Getting back to Napier, it turned out that he was a sexual predator, and one day he met Murphy's son Charlie when he was on the way home from school. He lured him into his van, and Charlie was never seen alive again. This is why the theme of child death is so prevalent in this game, with J.P. Sater and the train accident, the Ribbon side quest which reveals that a mother apparently had her autistic daughter killed, and the memos you find in the monastery regarding a scared child who ended up dying on an operating table. And more obviously, also in the monastery, Murphy gets to watch creepy-looking boy get his neck snapped. But seriously, the way he loses it and starts calling out Charlie's name, it's really heartbreaking.
Oh, God! Charlie!
Charlie. I'm sorry. So sorry.
Up until this point, we had gotten little hints here and there that Murphy had a son who was murdered, but this is the point where the game finally just flat out goes, yep, this happened.
Is he out there? Charlie!
Especially with the flashback that follows, which is even more heartbreaking.
Charlie! Charlie!
So Charlie's death obviously had a huge impact on Murphy and his wife, Carol, and their relationship. Murphy blamed himself, and Carol also blamed Murphy. Funny, I thought Charlie had two parents. But anyway, in the final level of the game at Overlook Penitentiary, the prison where Murphy was being transferred to in the beginning of the game, we get to read a pretty scathing letter from Carol telling Murphy that everything is his fault and she doesn't ever want to hear from him again. Damn.
Carol, where did they get this?
But yeah, hence why the Screamers might represent Carol. So the part of the story relating to Charlie is generally wrapped up in the monastery. You get to fight a recurring monster referred to as the Boogeyman. I'll talk more about him later, but he basically represents Napier to Murphy, and Charlie makes an appearance.
You killed him. You killed the Boogeyman.
I think it's both sad and interesting that Murphy doesn't run up to Charlie and hug him or something, with how much he obviously loved his kid. Maybe he realizes that Charlie isn't there, or maybe he just feels at this point that he's not worthy of Charlie's love, so he doesn't dare to try to indulge at all. In any case, this line gets to me every time.
It's not your fault.
Funny thing about this story, maybe it's just me, but when the Charlie-centric part of it wrapped up and there was still a whole other level to explore, I thought there was going to be something else revealed about Charlie's death, like maybe Napier would turn out to be just a scapegoat and something else happened, like the scared kid in the monastery that we read memos about. I was wondering if maybe that was Charlie.
Wrong, wrong, absolutely brimming over with wrong ability.
Or maybe he was the monster in the wheelchair.
Wrong and getting wronger all the time.
Though, in retrospect, I should have thought about that undisclosed favor that Murphy owed Sewell and realized that they wouldn't just leave that thread hanging. And the end of the monastery was wrapped up a little too tightly to be a red herring. But however clueless I might have been about it, I like how the story caught me off guard with a final twist.
Pendleton. Get on the bus.
So there is a very prominent character that I've intentionally left out until now, Anne Cunningham. From the very beginning of the game, there's a certain officer who is a bit obsessed with Murphy. I mean, sure, it makes sense that she'd try to apprehend him, but she really goes to extreme lengths to try to do it, and nearly assassinates him at one point. At another, it appears that she does. And she makes it clear pretty early on that this isn't about doing her job. It's personal. Not that poor Murphy has any idea what it's about.
I don't know who you think I am, or what you think I've done.
Shut the hell up!
By the way, is it wrong that I find this scene kind of hot?
On your knees.
Oh yeah, Murphy's been a bad boy.
You think this is funny, don't you? Well, let's see how funny it is with a fucking bullet in your head.
Okay, that's taking it a bit far. I don't think Murphy knows the safety word. But what really set her off was finding a badge in Murphy's pocket. He has no idea whose it is or where it came from. It was already in the pocket of that clothing when he found it. But basically, she stalks him throughout the game.
Put the gun down, damn it.
Now, I'm finally getting to the story's ending, but first I wanted to mention that her character model and animation are spot on. You can tell that she and Murphy are the two main characters because clearly they have the most amount of time spent on them. She's really pretty, but not unrealistically so, and she's not overtly sexualized or anything. Yeah, I'm looking at you, Officer Leatherpants. And damn, she's got some intense eyes. Oh, and here's some early concept art where she reminds me of Jill Valentine.
Here's a lockpick. It might be handy if you, the master of unlocking, take it with you.
Thanks. Maybe I'll need it.
Her name could be a reference to the character Walter Cunningham in To Kill a Mockingbird. He forms a mob to hang an innocent convict the day before his trial, but realizes that the man could be innocent, and so he disbands the mob. Apparently, Downpour originally intended to be a co-op game, with Anne being the second player. Not sure how that could have worked. I'm imagining something more along the lines of Legacy of Kain Defiance, but I could be way off there. But they ended up scrapping it due to time constraints, and I'm kinda glad they did. Silent Hill doesn't need anything like that. The Born from a Wish scenario from Silent Hill 2 is one thing, where it's a short side game. We're talking about evenly dividing the story between two characters. I just don't see how they could have pulled that off.
What was that about? Nothing.
Hey, don't bullshit a bullshitter. Sewell's bad news, Murph. He doesn't do anyone favors. What are you in for with him?
It's nothing. Don't worry about it.
For your sake? I hope so.
So there's one final character that I haven't mentioned yet. There are several points in the game where Murphy seems to hear a voice in his head. The same voice every time of a wise older man who wanted to help Murphy at some point in his life.
You can't undo anything you've already done. But you can face up to it. Learn from yesterday, live for today, and hope for tomorrow.
Murphy, run!
Never let go of this. One day you'll see that it's all come together. You'll look back and laugh at what's past, and you'll ask yourself, how the hell did I get through all that?
During those times when Murphy is hearing his voice, his reflection will even show up in a mirror if there's one in the room.
Trust yourself, Murph. You know more than you think you do.
So far I've only caught that once, and it was during my third playthrough. You really have to know to look for it. That guy is Officer Frank Coleridge, one of the guards at Rial State Prison who we get to see in flashbacks. He helped Murphy get an early parole and seemed to think highly of him, and that he was somehow different from the other prisoners.
Yeah, you stole a police cruiser and let him on a 10-hour chase down the eastern seaboard. What makes a guy with no priors and a clean sight do something that stupid?
Seriously, you gotta love Frank, he's awesome. So on one side we have Sewell, who is staging murders and probably all other kinds of illegal shit, and so far getting away with it. On the other side we have Frank, who is aware of this and trying to get him busted. Meanwhile, Sewell has a standing deal with Murphy that Murphy will kill someone for Sewell, but he doesn't specify who. Oh, and he threatens to blackmail Murphy if he doesn't agree. Sewell is obviously the one wielding the power here, so it's not like Murphy has much of a choice but to comply. Yeah, this isn't gonna end well. So Sewell sets up a prison riot as a distraction, as he did when he set up Napier's murder. I guess it started like this. But I like to pretend it started like this.
From now on, marshmallow ass, you're my bitch. You're what? B-I-H, bitch.
In any case, Murphy went into the showers as he did the first time, only to find Frank Coleridge there. I think it takes a second to sink in. Murphy must be thinking, wait, what happened to the guy I was supposed to kill? And what's Frank doing here? Oh. Frank is even relieved that it's just Murphy and not someone dangerous.
Jeez, I'm glad it's just you. This thing is kicking off something fierce. I knew you'd be smart enough to steer clear of it.
Ouch.
This isn't what I agreed to.
What are you talking about? Agreed to what?
Tell him, Murph.
Oh great, here comes Sewell.
Why didn't you answer the radio?
Should've learned to keep your big fucking mouth shut, Frank.
I won't do it.
Yeah, I thought you might say that.
No! Murphy? Run!
It's very telling of Frank's character that his main concern, while lying on the ground half concussed, is for Murphy to be safe. Double ouch.
You son of a...
I'm not gonna tell you again.
Whether it was Murphy or Sewell who delivered that final blow depends on your actions throughout the game. Not sure how I feel about that, but I'll go more into that later. So, Frank was murdered. Or was he? Throughout the game, there's a monster in a wheelchair who shows up repeatedly as if stalking Murphy, not to mention that you see tracks everywhere, so it seems to be one step ahead of you. You also fight a giant version of it as the final boss, which you defeat by literally unplugging its life support. But after you kill it, it looks different.
That thing tried to kill me. It's not a man, it's a monster.
Also, we find out why Anne hates Murphy so much.
You know, he was a great man, my dad. He didn't die right away, you know. Did you know that? And I had to watch this wonderful man shit and piss all over himself day after day after day. And every time I looked at him, I saw a monster. I saw you.
Frank wasn't murdered. He was beaten within an inch of his life and left in a vegetative state for years. Damn, Silent Hill, what do you have against nice people anyway?
It wasn't you.
But Anne, who clearly has been on her own journey of discovery, realizes that Murphy is not to blame for what happened to Frank, and she forgives him.
I'm so sorry.
I forgive you.
Aww. There isn't enough hugging in this series. Silent Hill protagonists have earned it more than anyone. By the way, the badly modeled girl from the monastery also represents Anne, with how she regarded Murphy as a monster and probably reverted into a childlike state upon her father's death due to feelings of helplessness.
Wait! Come back!
Welcome home. Glory be to God.
Okay, there is one more monster I haven't talked about, and he is a biggie, meaning his size and his importance to the story. Throughout the game, you periodically run into a very large humanoid monster who is wielding a very large sledgehammer made out of a very large and very heavy cinder block. In the beginning, he represents Patrick Napier to Murphy. And I'm gonna say right now, if you're expecting me to call him a ripoff of Pyramid Head and complain about it, you're gonna be disappointed. I'm not gonna pretend there are any similarities. Again, it's a big humanoid monster who wields a big weapon, it kills people in front of you, and it symbolizes judgment in a way. I get it. But for one thing, he looks nothing like Pyramid Head, and he uses a blunt weapon instead of a sharp one. I mean, this is not a ripoff of Pyramid Head. This is a ripoff of Pyramid Head. See the difference? But where Pyramid Head symbolizes how James judges himself, the Boogeyman symbolizes how Murphy judges Napier, and later how Anne judges Murphy. So no, he's not a ripoff. They're just using a similar theme, and they might even be intentionally invoking similar ideas because of that, but it's not as if they're reusing Pyramid Head again. I only have 2 complaints about the Boogeyman, and they're kinda nitpicky. First of all, I feel like he's a little too humanoid. He literally looks like a guy in a gas mask and a raincoat. And like some of the other monsters, he does look cool, just maybe not as Silent Hill-like as I would like. But on the other hand, I do kind of understand why he does. He's meant to invoke certain people, Napier and Murphy, so in that context it does make sense that he'd look very humanoid. Incidentally, he did look less humanoid in earlier designs, but they ended up toning it down. Kind of interesting. I wish they at least kept the chains, I think those look cool. The gas mask rubs me the wrong way a little. Reminds me too much of the movies in Homecoming. I feel like gas masks are suddenly synonymous with Silent Hill now, and in the game's universe that just doesn't make sense. But I do like that he doesn't have any visible eyes. I kind of feel like Silent Hill monsters shouldn't have eyes. Usually they don't, and I think that's what bothers me about the more humanoid monsters in this game. I probably wouldn't notice as much if they didn't have eyes. The only other complaint, and like I said, it's nitpicky, is that he's called the damn Boogeyman. I get how it ties in with the theme of child abduction and murder, but they already used that term in Homecoming as a name for Pyramid Head. It's just a little too derivative. And also, why do they spell it with 1 O? I always thought it was 2. Wouldn't this spell Bogeyman? Which always makes me imagine this.
He's looking at you, kid.
But oh well, I do think he's a pretty cool monster and a good addition to the Silent Hill mythos.
You can't just forget. You alone decide your fate.
No fond farewell? You gonna miss us?
Not even a little.
Give it a couple of days at Wayside Max. I bet you'll start to miss this place after all. 'Cause we sure are gonna miss you.
So obviously I've talked about Murphy a lot already, with this being his story and all, but I wanted to go into some of his finer details that I hadn't had a chance to hit on before now. So in some ways, Murphy is a typical Silent Hill protagonist. Young man, cute, troubled, generally a good guy, though he's more rough around the edges than previous ones. This isn't a sweet, quiet, gentle soul like Henry Townsend. Murphy has a bit of a temper, and when he gets mad at you, he makes damn sure you know about it. Also, I feel like there's a little bit of Heather in him.
Thanks.
He's not as abrasive and snarky, but he's definitely a bit of a deadpan snarker.
Looks like somebody has specific taste in entertainment.
And I didn't realize how much I missed that. Also, I like how he talks to himself a lot.
Panel's busted.
Bingo. Finally. Back outside.
Gives him a bit more personality.
Nice. A long time since I had real clothes.
One thing that sets him apart from the earlier protagonists is that he doesn't regard all the weirdness of Silent Hill with quiet confusion or any other kind of lack of reaction. He basically reacts in what I think is a more realistic way, where he lashes out a bit and that short temper of his comes through. Again, a little like Heather. It's like, this shit is not right and he is not going to put up with it, for all the good that does. Makes me want to plunk him into other Silent Hill games and see how that plays out.
To seal this town to the abyss, the mark of Samael.
What the hell are you talking about?
Could let you have it, but not for free.
Man, cut the bullshit.
I'm really thirsty.
Whatever.
Aren't you Maria?
I am. If you want me to be.
I came through hell and high water to get here because you called me. Now cut the bullshit, because I don't have time for this.
But despite his attitude and darker side, I think he's generally a decent guy, considering that he tries to help people who are in trouble, or thinks they are. Like I mentioned before, in the case of J.P. Sater, you can choose to either console him, not much consoling by the way, he just yells wait a second, or taunt him. The taunting seems a little out of character, but I can kind of see how he'd be able to sympathize with the parents of the victims of the train accident, and then he wouldn't have much sympathy left over for Sater, and that he could end up being maybe a little more crass than he would otherwise. Also early in the game, Anne is trying to cross a dangerous cliff to get to Murphy and she slips. You can choose whether to help her up or not. She falls either way, just as Sater jumps either way, but it still affects the ending.
Shit!
Now here, if you choose not to help her, I do feel that Murphy is out of character. I can understand him not wanting to go back to prison. It could even be said that letting her fall is the smarter choice.
I am not going back to prison.
Help me!
Sorry.
but his indifference about it is downright chilling.
I warned you about the cliff.
Speaking of Murphy's dark side, it's great how right in the beginning they turn things around. Your protagonist appears to be the cold-blooded murderer in that scene, who is killing a pathetic, helpless guy. They make it clear that there's revenge involved, so we can imagine that maybe the victim in this scene is getting what's coming to him, but boy. I'm actually going to take back something I said earlier. I said I enjoy killing Napier. I'm not sure if that's going to be the case next time I play this game. During the editing process, I've had to watch this scene over and over, and it's starting to get to me a little. It really is brutal. And it's foreshadowing in a way. Later, Murphy comes to the conclusion that he's no better than Napier, which is punctuated by his removing the boogeyman's mask, and the face revealed flickering back and forth between Murphy's and Napier's. And Murphy expresses his regret over killing him.
Doesn't matter. It didn't bring you back. Nothing can bring you back. I'm sorry.
But it's interesting to note that the scene with Napier is actually a dream sequence. Who knows if it really went this way exactly, if Murphy was really so cold and calculating throughout the entire thing. In one of the endings, Sewell reveals that Murphy couldn't even finish Napier off in the end, so Sewell had to do it.
I serve him to you like a fucking Christmas goose, and you can't even finish the job. No, I gotta go in there and finish the bastard off for you.
Like I said, interesting.
One little favor in return.
So I can't remember at what point during my first playthrough that I put 2 and 2 together and figured out that Murphy got himself put in jail for the sole purpose of getting a shot at the guy who murdered his son, but I thought that was pretty badass. Especially since he did it by hijacking a police car and leading them on a chase for 10 hours. I thought that was both insanely stupid and insanely awesome. But at what cost? I guess since his son was dead and his wife had divorced him, he figured he had nothing left to lose, but he sure threw away whatever slim chance of moving on he may have had. By the way, there's a book in the Centennial Building that talked about Murphy in an abstract way by comparing his self-destructive revenge scheme to a bee using its stinger and causing its own death. The barbed stinger of the honeybee pulls the lancet deep into the skin of the victim, injecting 1 milligram of apitoxin. When the bee attempts to flee the scene of the crime, it finds that a large part of its abdomen, guts, nerve, and muscle tissue are torn from its body and left behind. Eviscerated, the bee dies shortly after, paying the ultimate price for revenge. Which is freaking brilliant! Unfortunately, as soon as my brain made the connection that Murphy is a bee, I immediately imagined this.
I'm a king, baby, want you to be my queen.
But yeah, Murphy sure screwed up his life in an epic way. He's pretty nonchalant about it up until a certain point in the monastery where he breaks down and has this raw display of emotion, which seems to be a requirement for most Silent Hill protagonists.
When they got out to the Lord in their trouble,
I screwed up,
he saved
but I didn't
them.
see any other
He
way.
brought them out of darkness.
You don't
and the
know what it
shadow
was
of
like
death,
to
and
know it
broke
was
their
my
bonds
fault
apart.
he was gone. Every
You who
time I
seek God,
shut
let
my
your heart
eyes,
revive.
I saw Charlie's
For the
face,
Lord
and
hates
all I
the
could
needy and
think
does not
was,
despise
that
his
monster
who are
is still
possessed.
alive, but I'll never get to see
Amen.
my boy again. Why are you doing this to me? What do you want?
But in short, Murphy is a wonderfully complex, multi-layered character with some contradictions to his personality. For any little gripes I might have about this game, it's like none of them really matter because it has Murphy, damn it! Oh, and another thing I should probably touch on? We've got another potty mouth on our hands.
You gotta be shitting me.
But in Murphy's defense, it generally sounds natural.
Oh, shit.
Like stuff a person would actually yell out when startled.
What the hell is this?
He doesn't sound like he's trying to be creative or cool about it like Alex does.
Fuck!
It seems like it just slips out, so I'm not gonna tease Murphy about it. Except that this one bit is kind of funny.
Shit!
Justified maybe, but still kind of funny. Sorry, Murphy. So here's something interesting that I think the developers did on purpose to pay homage to the earlier games. Since Silent Hill 2 dealt with murder, and Silent Hill 4 dealt with incarceration, and Downpour deals with both of those themes, Murphy kind of looks like a cross between James Sunderland and Henry Townsend. He really looks like Henry. His facial structure is a bit different, and Henry is cuter in my opinion, but he has almost the same hairstyle.
What the hell? What the hell? What the hell?
What the hell?
What the hell? What the hell?
And there's that too. He doesn't look a whole lot like James, but he has nearly the same color scheme, especially earlier in development when he was blonde. I kind of wish he'd stayed that way. We haven't had a blonde protagonist in a while, but oh well. Murphy's name is an allusion to fictional character Randall McMurphy, a convict who was transferred to a mental hospital from a prison work camp in Pendleton, Oregon, in the novel One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
What I did to Napier didn't solve anything. Charlie was still gone, and I was stuck in prison. Everything spiraled out of control. It was my fault. I just want my life back.
Revenge is a long, treacherous road, isn't it, Mr. Pendleton? Where do you suppose it ends?
Speaking of references to earlier games, there are a lot, but I'm gonna start with my favorite. Remember how I complained in my Silent Hill 4 episode about how that game is generally hated and the later games don't reference it when they easily could? Well, we finally got one, and it's a big one. There's a secret apartment you can access by a ladder, and it's Henry's apartment. No writing on the door, but most of the other fun details are there. Chains on the door, even that ubiquitous pair of shoes. Several songs from earlier in the series play from radios or by DJ Bobby Ricks.
So watch your back and keep it on track. It's always a perfect day with DJ Ricks, your on-air friend to the end.
What do you do now?
I'm going to Silent Hill.
What's in Silent Hill?
I don't know.
There are others, but those two are the ones I noticed the most. According to the Silent Hill Wiki, creator Devin Shatsky cited many influences and inspirations for the game, including One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Jacob's Ladder, Suspiria, The Walking Dead, The Shawshank Redemption, The Fugitive, and The Call of Cthulhu. I was not able to catch all of those, especially since I haven't seen all those movies or read all those books, but I suspect that the beginning of the surprise ending is a nod to Shawshank Redemption, and I couldn't help but notice that a recurring name on memos is Brian Handley, which sounds a lot like Byron Hadley, the prison guard captain at Shawshank. I noticed another memo was signed by Roberta Block, a fairly obvious reference to Robert Block, author of Psycho. Another memo quotes Detective Elliot Benson, which is another fairly obvious reference, this time to detectives Elliot Stabler and Olivia Benson from Law & Order SVU. The second Silent Hill game to reference that, by the way, since one of the versions of Sybil in Shattered Memories resembled Olivia. I guess it's about time to wrap this up, but first I just wanted to mention a couple more things. So one more aspect of this game that feels like a bit of a throwback to Shattered Memories, seriously, I'm beginning to forget which game I'm supposed to be talking about here, is that your actions during the game affect what happened in the past and what sort of person Murphy is, somewhat. I'm not too big on that idea. The reason it worked in Shattered Memories was because Harry was the focus of that story, and wasn't a real person, and the entire thing took place within Cheryl's mind. You could say that she was in control of Harry's actions in a way. But Downpour takes place within the real world within the context of the game, and it's just kind of weird. Plus, in a way, I liked how your character had to deal with their past in earlier games. No matter how happy of an ending you got, Mary and Josh were still dead, Heather was still Alessa, etc. I was just kind of disappointed to learn that Murphy didn't kill Napier in one of the endings. And the execution ending just kind of makes me mad. Although I do like this line.
I'll see you in hell. Cupcake.
But I prefer it being said while Murphy pulled a gun on him or something. There is a running theme regarding birds in this game. In the flashback where the police are pulling Charlie's body out of the lake and Murphy screams his name, he disturbs a big flock of crows in the trees. But up until that scene is revealed, it seems like Murphy can't go anywhere without disturbing a flock of crows, which I'm going to assume is meant to be reference to that flashback. Birds are usually symbolic of freedom, so that could be another purpose of including them. There's also a book in the Centennial Building talking about ancient priests predicting the future by studying birds.
Poor little guy.
Also, there's a side quest I feel I have to do every time I play Downpour. There are 5 bird cages scattered throughout the town, and as you free each bird, a piece of scene plays out, involving a sentimental little vision of Charlie. Aww.
Charlie.
Also, I feel like I should talk about the music because this is the first Silent Hill game to not have music composed by Akira Yamaoka. It is noticeable because Danya Light's style is so different, but it's generally good and it works fine for this game. The title screen music is great, even if it reminds me of the dungeon music from Legend of Zelda. Seriously, is it just me? But anyway, the song that plays in the beginning is also great. And I even love that song that Korn did for the trailer. And the rest is unimposing. For the most part, it isn't the kind of soundtrack you rock out to or hum along with. It's mainly for ambiance. Sometimes it feels like a bit of a throwback to the soundtrack to the original Silent Hill game. But it works, and if you can get over the idea that it's different, it's a very effective horror game soundtrack. And there are a couple little mind screws that I'm just throwing in here because I didn't get to mention them earlier for some reason. There's a great one in the monastery where a playground has a tire swing, and when you look away and then look back, there's a body. Then it's a tire swing again. If you don't know to look for that, it can really throw you off guard. Also, during the loading screen, it does the usual thing where they throw gameplay hints up on the screen in text form. There are a few messages that are just there to mess with your head that pop up randomly, like, "We're all slowly dying," "Why are you lying?" and my favorite because it was after I had died and restarted the game, and I honestly thought it was criticizing my gameplay. Stop doing that! I just think that's pretty cool. Well, that's Silent Hill Downpour in a nutshell. It's not the best, it's not even my favorite of the post-Team Silent games. Shattered Memory still holds that title, but it's still a damn good game in its own right. There was clearly a lot of thought put into it, and it absolutely deserves the Silent Hill title, and I think Murphy is one of my favorite protagonists. If you haven't played it yet, give it a chance. The series isn't quite what it used to be, but it's far from dead. It's still Silent Hill, it still deserves attention. That's it for now. See you next time.
Nice shooting, son. What's your name?
Murphy.
Hey, this is Dina. Well, I keep saying I'll talk about the first Silent Hill game, but I've already had to move twice this year, and so I just have not had time to make a proper Game Den episode. So what could I talk about that wouldn't have to be a big multi-part video? As you may remember, I did a top 5 list of things I hated about the Silent Hill movie a few years ago. As I kind of alluded to in that video, I felt like I was poking at a wasp's nest with a stick, because a lot of fans like that movie for some reason, so I tried to tread carefully and tried to be as kind to the movie as I could, all things considered. That's not gonna happen this time. While I thought the first movie was bad and a very misguided attempt at a Silent Hill movie, it doesn't really reach Catwoman levels of train wreck bad. It's just all style and no substance, basically. It looks pretty, it has a great atmosphere, it's shot well, and the monsters look really good. But when you really break it down, it is a bad movie. But the sequel? This was a second attempt at a Silent Hill movie. It had a chance to learn from the first movie's mistakes and make things better. It couldn't go back in time and fix the first movie, but it could have been smart about it and just taken it in a better and more Silent Hill-like direction. Instead, it went the opposite way, completely into train wreck territory. Even fans of the first movie don't like the sequel. The movie is awful, period. I promise I'm not exaggerating, but in the theater, I laughed during a lot of it. I laughed! This is a movie that is based on a franchise that is generally deep, dark, somber, and quietly disturbing. And they missed the mark so far that the end result is hilarious. And I wish I could say I found it enjoyable in an ironic way because of that, but I don't. It just hurts my brain that they managed to fuck it up so bad. It's like I have to laugh so I don't cry. But what is it about this movie that makes it so bad? Well, I almost feel like I'm shooting fish in a barrel here, but like I did with the first movie, I'm narrowing it down to 5 overall points. And once again, yes, only 5, but they are 5 big things.
Number 5.
Yeah, a lot of the complaints I had about the first movie not only showed up in the sequel, but were cranked up to 11. One of the big ones is the lack of subtlety and a general feel of how this movie is just trying too damn hard. I mean, the first time Heather ends up in the other world, one of the first things we see is a living victim hung upside down while a butcher cuts a thick slice of flesh from his stomach and cooks it. And yes, I am actually censoring this for anyone who doesn't have the stomach for this level of gore, no pun intended. I still protest about an excess of gore and torture in anything Silent Hill related because I don't think it fits the general feel of the games that happened before the first movie. But also, it is completely gratuitous here. This happens right after Heather is watching a birthday party where people are eating burgers and then suddenly they're eating bloody viscera. What the hell is that supposed to symbolize? Unless Heather is an ethical vegan in this movie and thinks meat is murder, there's no reason for this imagery except that the director found it disturbing and threw it in because yay, gore. Other than that, there are flashbacks added of when Alessa was burned. I don't know if you noticed, but she actually doesn't move at all in the first movie, and we actually get to see her writhe in agony this time. Thanks, movie, that was totally necessary. Also, this time they added jump scares. Lots and lots of jump scares. None of which actually made me jump because they were set up in such obvious ways. I pretty much always saw them coming. It's like, oh, there's the Robbie the Rabbit costume for Silent Hill 3. I wonder when it'll suddenly turn its head and look at the camera. There we go. And then of course there's the silly Pop-Tart thing, which I think is supposed to make us jump and then laugh at ourselves for jumping. Well, it didn't work. It's just the most blatant example of this movie trying to scare us and failing. We're laughing at the movie and not with it. Oh, and I have to go on record as saying that I just don't like this 3D gimmick in general. I don't like having things shoved in my face, and a Silent Hill movie definitely doesn't need to have anything like that. Now, when Heather goes to the town and we see some of the ash falling in the foreground and some of it in the background, the 3D actually does add some depth and it's kind of cool. But for the most part, it just used the 3D aspect to basically be all in your face, as obnoxious about it as possible, with dismembered body parts flying at the camera.
You gotta be shitting me. Number 4.
I've said this before, but one thing the first movie absolutely nailed was the visuals. The monsters looked great, the sets looked great, and it was generally shot well. You could tell that a lot of love and hard work was put into those aspects. Really, my main complaint about the first movie is that that's just not enough. It needed to have a good story and not rely on gore and shock so much. Silent Hill is not just about pretty visuals. But the second movie did not even have that going for it. Just about all the monsters from the first movie showed up again and looked just as good, but that's nothing new. Most other monsters are mainly regular people with messed up faces, again, usually used as jump scares. They looked convincing enough, it's just that it's not that impressive compared to what we saw in the first movie. Then we have the CG mannequin monster, which just looks very CG and unconvincing to me. Not to mention that it doesn't scare me, I just think it's obnoxious. I mean, I realize that it's made out of plastic, so maybe this is as realistic as it could have gotten, but it just doesn't work. I am speaking as someone with a pretty intense fear of spiders, and this thing just does not trigger that. Ironically, one of the monsters from Silent Hill 3 ended up being human for most of his part in Revelation. Of course, I'm talking about Leonard, who is actually brilliantly played by Malcolm McDowell.
Hello, child.
I'll get more into that later, but again, I'm not all that impressed by him as a monster once that happens. Although his face reminds me of the terror mask from Splatterhouse, which is kind of interesting. One thing this movie is lacking is the way the first one kind of reveled in the pretty environments. I actually really dig shots like this one. There's no dialogue here, just music and visuals, and you're just kind of left to just take it all in. There was nothing like this in the sequel. Like I said, the 3D effect of the falling ash was neat, and also this shot of Harry disappearing into the fog at the end looked kind of neat too. Plus, I like the camera movement here.
It's safer to be inside.
But for the most part, the environments are just there and aren't especially interesting like they were in the first movie. Most of the time, the movie is trying to cram exposition down your throat as fast as possible. No time to take anything else in.
Number 3.
With the first movie not really following the original game, I realized that trying to continue the first movie's plot and adapt Silent Hill 3 all in one movie is not the easiest task. But I do believe it could have worked if they had just not focused on the first movie so much and not tried to retcon it in a misguided attempts to please fans of the games. The most blatant one is where Dahlia shows up and is all, "No, see, they didn't actually want to kill Alessa, they actually wanted to impregnate her. Blah blah blah, Silent Hill 3 plot somewhat." No, bullcrap. The first movie is pretty clear about why they wanted baked Alessa. It was a stupid and cliche reason, but it was there. And this scene is fairly inconsequential aside from trying to please the fans. They could have kept it the way the first movie had it, and it wouldn't have really changed much of anything in this one. Also, there's visual things like Dark Alessa looking different, not to mention that she shouldn't exist anyway since she merged with Sharon at the end of the first movie. Who also shouldn't be there are the townspeople. It could be that maybe a few survived, but this movie makes it look like the slaughter at the end of the first movie never even happened since they all appear to still be there. Also, they seem to have missed the fact that Dahlia and Christabella were sisters.
You're weak, my dear sister. You always were.
Because in this movie, they have Claudia and Christabella being sisters.
What my sister Christabella could not achieve, I shall.
Which would also make Claudia and Dahlia sisters, which would also make Heather and Vincent cousins. You know, the two main characters in this movie who have a budding romance. Wow, that is so sloppy. I could see something like that happening before the invention of TV and internet, when people only saw movies in the theaters, and audiences might have forgotten details like that. But there's no excuse for that in this day and age. Do your damn homework, directors. Jesus. There's other stuff too, but this is just the stuff that really jumped out at me. Go to the Silent Hill wiki for a complete list. And I know you may be saying, but Dina, you hated the first movie. Why do you care if the sequel retcons it? Like I said, it's sloppy. The damage had already been done with the first movie. If you're not going to reboot it, find a way to work around it without cheating. Also, the director had previously stated that they were first and foremost making a sequel to the first movie. They were not changing anything in it, and adapting Silent Hill 3 was secondary. So it's kind of weird that the opposite ended up happening.
Number 2.
I kind of let this one go when I talked about the first movie, but I guess it would have been number 6 on my list, since it was only the one character and I considered the other points to be more important. I'm talking about Dahlia and how they made up this completely different character and just slapped Dahlia's name on her.
They hurt my child. They did terrible things to her.
Which is weird, because Christabella is almost playing Dahlia's role in this movie.
The demon! The demon!
The demon taking that child's form.
But for whatever reason, they wanted Alessa's mother to be a sympathetic character. Whatever. In the sequel, the in-name only thing applies to 2 main characters who happen to be 2 of my favorite characters in the whole franchise, instead of just an antagonist. And this movie kind of touts itself as being a Silent Hill 3 adaptation, so I put it a little higher on the list this time.
Remember me, and your true self as well.
I don't know that I was expecting much from Claudia in this movie. In Silent Hill 3, she comes across as just evil in the beginning, but the more she shows up, the more you learn about her. It turns out that she had a horrible childhood, with the only bright spot being her best friend Alessa. Alessa, who ended up being sacrificed by the cult because they needed her to be used as a vessel to birth their god. Meanwhile, Claudia became more and more influenced by the cult and decided she needed to end all the suffering in the world. which basically means Judgment Day. Everyone dies, but then everyone ends up in paradise, all saved and happy. She makes this amazing speech toward the end where she admits that what she's doing to Alessa, who is now Heather, is horrible. And even though she thinks it's necessary, she also believes that she will not be forgiven, and she is totally okay with that.
Even if it was to save mankind. It was too deep a sin.
She's basically condemning her own soul to save everyone else's. Really heavy stuff. This is what I love about Claudia. She comes across as evil on the surface. Not only her appearance, but the fact that she has Harry Mason, Heather's dad and Silent Hill 1 protagonist, killed. But she turns out to be someone who really only wants to do good by other people, even if her methods are so misguided that it end up having the opposite effect. I didn't expect her to have that kind of complexity in the movie, especially since they established in the first movie that Alessa didn't have any friends, and of course there was no mention of Claudia before her appearance in this movie.
Your mind is corrupted by her darkness.
So yeah, movie Claudia isn't all that interesting. She's got the fanaticism, and there's a scene where she's doing that Shakespearean monologuing like she does in the game.
The god can only be born through your flesh.
And I have to give Carrie-Anne Moss credit for managing to have a great presence and just projecting well.
To cleanse the world of its sins.
Not unlike Claudia in the game did. But she's lacking the depth of the character from the game. She's basically Claudia from Silent Hill 3 before we learn anything about her. Also, she's been aged up since she's supposed to be old enough to be the mother of Heather's love interest. Oh yeah, I am definitely gonna go into that later. The effect is that she kind of looks like a Halloween witch. No offense toward Carrie-Anne Moss at all. She looked totally hot in the Matrix movies, but that long frizzy white hair is not doing her any favors. Also, rather than wearing the black coat and long skirt combo from the games, she's wearing this floor-length white gown, which is really similar to an early character design for Claudia in the game. Not sure why they went with that. It's actually really nice looking, it has a lot of neat little details on it, but she kind of looks like she's on her way to a Renaissance fair or something. It's a little weird. Not necessarily bad, but weird. Don't even get me started on her being the missionary, though actually I'm gonna get into that later too.
Leonard. Hello, child.
By the way, Leonard also gets the in-name only treatment. A lot of fans were annoyed by the fact that he was human, but I never thought he was actually a monster in the game anyway. That's just how Heather saw him, since he didn't actually show himself until after he started showing the monstrous side of his personality through his monologue.
Leonard? Is that you?
Death to all who turn their backs on God.
It ties into this famous comment by Vincent.
Monsters? They look like monsters to you?
So yeah, I'm okay with Leonard looking human. In fact, with it being Malcolm McDowell, I can see why they'd want to show his face.
Now, I see the truth of you.
You're a demon! You must be destroyed!
I was actually kind of jazzed about him playing Leonard when I first heard about it, mainly because I thought he would be playing Leonard from the games. You know, that really fanatical guy with a scary voice who was all death to the non-believers?
Heretic! You plan to destroy God!
I told you I wasn't trying to trick anyone.
I know the voice actor kind of hammed it up, but I honestly felt it suited the character. Same with Claudia. They're both kind of dramatic and Shakespearean.
I was appointed by God to be its guardian.
Malcolm McDowell playing that guy would have been awesome. Instead, he's a messed up, crazy blind guy who Claudia has locked up and experimented on.
My own daughter says I'm corrupted by the darkness. She says that I'm a monster. She's far worse than I am.
He's actually an okay character in his own right. Definitely creepy, but...
Come closer so I can touch you.
I don't think so.
I really wish they'd followed Silent Hill 3 with this one.
Sorry, I didn't mean to scare you.
Sorry, what?
Are you okay?
Also, I'll really quickly mention Douglas. I actually liked him during the small amount of screen time he got. He's maybe a little young, but he just kind of reminds me of Douglas from the game somehow.
My name is Douglas Cardlin. I'm a private investigator.
Unfortunately, they try to have him cram in a lot of exposition in a small amount of time, and then he immediately gets killed off. So, yeah, way to go, movie. They really could have just left him out. Well, I'm saving the worst for last. Here goes. As I've mentioned in the Game Den episode of Silent Hill 3, and probably at some point in the horror cast, I love Vincent. As I've said, he and Claudia are two of my favorite characters in all of Silent Hill. He doesn't have that kind of depth that Claudia has, and he definitely doesn't garner much sympathy, but he's just a really fun character.
I fear her, and I adore her, but I haven't lost my mind like you. You think that this is the work of God?
He is that guy who just kind of sits back and watches everything. He doesn't get directly involved enough to get his hands dirty, but he tries to manipulate things from behind the scenes.
Heather, go ahead and kill this crazy bitch. This demon who claims to speak for God.
He's kind of a coward, but he's also kind of awesome in a way. He knows exactly what's going on, but he is too cool to reveal much of it.
If you know everything, then tell me how I can put an end to this.
Not yet.
Why not enjoy yourself a bit longer?
Also, again, he says this awesome line.
Monsters? They look like monsters to you? Oh no. Don't worry. It's just a joke.
Interpret it however you want, but you cannot deny that it got your attention. And there's some interesting symbolism with him that I think I hadn't picked up on when I covered Silent Hill 3 on the Game Den. He has bad teeth. See, he's well dressed and looks all nice and polished on the outside, but when he smiles, you see that bad part of himself that he hides. Also, his eyes are weird. One looks at the camera or Heather, and the other looks in a different direction. Also, one pupil is bigger than the other. So yeah, Vincent is not a deep and complex character like Claudia, but he is intriguing.
Wait! I'm not finished talking!
You know what's not intriguing? A teenage love interest.
Are you kidding me? I can't follow that.
Okay, I'll be fair. He's not as bad in the movie as I thought he was gonna be. Before the movie came out, they were describing Vincent as being a guy from Heather's school, and I expected the worst. But it turned out that he is at least a cult member in the movie, so Heather has reason not to trust him. But of course, he is still a 17-year-old kid, he's still a love interest, and the movie tries to make him into a whoopee with how he's so tortured but still a good person, blah blah blah. The funny part is that the director apparently thought this was an improvement. Apparently he just thought of Vincent in Silent Hill 3 as someone who didn't really do much of anything, and that he used this as an opportunity to do something more interesting with him. So this?
It's just endless realities all piled on top of each other. Some people see monsters, other people just see people.
And they locked him up for that?
My mother had him committed.
Is more interesting than this.
Monsters? They look like monsters to you?
I got nothing.
Number 1.
Okay, this is sort of the in-name only argument again, but there's way more to it. I'm not going to go into why Pyramid Head shouldn't be in anything outside of Silent Hill 2, because not only have I already covered it, I've pretty much run it into the ground. But if you really want to know my thoughts on that, go watch the video I made about the first movie, starting at about 7 minutes in. Also, he was in the first movie, so I sorta get them bringing him back for the sake of continuity. Even though he's basically replacing Valtiel and I would rather have seen him in the movie, I still sorta get it. But they basically made him a good guy. And again, I sorta get him being Alessa's protector. The first movie made it seem like he's being controlled by Alessa, or his actions were triggered by her emotions, something like that. But that doesn't make it any less fucking stupid. I mean, the creature that was originally created to symbolize a man's sexual frustration is now a young girl's protector. Does no one see anything wrong with that? But yeah, Pyramid Head is Godzilla now. He can just be on either side. Maybe in a third movie they'll have a giant Pyramid Head trampling buildings and fighting Mecha Pyramid Head in Tokyo. Why the hell not? It wouldn't be much stupider than what they did with him in this movie. Speaking of Pyramid Head fighting other monsters, oh boy. Well, first let me talk about the missionary. Wait, not that one. Yeah, that one. Instead of Claudia sending the missionary after Harry, like in the game, in the movie Claudia is the missionary, which doesn't make sense because if she's the leader of this cult, why is she doing all her own dirty work? That means that she went out and killed Douglas herself and stalked Heather all the way back to Silent Hill, despite the fact that none of the cult members are supposed to be able to leave Silent Hill, hence why Vincent had to get that nifty tattoo. This movie can't even follow its own story, let alone the story of the first movie or Silent Hill 3. But really the main issue I have with the missionary is that it doesn't look like anything that could have come out of Silent Hill. It's just completely the wrong style. It's too humanoid looking, it kind of looks like a dominatrix, and from what I can tell, it doesn't really symbolize anything. However, it does look like whoever designed it was a big Hellraiser fan. She basically looks like an amalgam of various female Cenobites. It's just not that interesting of a design. Although I get where they're going with her in a way. On one hand, you have Pyramid Head, who is really big and slow-moving with a really big blade. So to offset that, you have the Missionary, who is smaller and faster, and while she also has a blade, it's not as big as his. But here's where the shit really hits the fan. The whole movie has been leading up to this epic battle at the end. And it just tries so hard to be awesome, yet it just falls flat on its face. It's just painful to watch for all the wrong reasons. Despite how stupid this premise is, it actually could have been a good way to show how fast and efficient of a killer the Missionary is. We've seen her kill people, but seeing her go up against something really big and powerful could have been cool. But she really doesn't move that fast and doesn't really come across as that impressive despite getting in a couple of really nasty blows. The choreography just isn't that interesting. I honestly just see it like this.
Pyramid Head, I choose you!
So this causes the town to go back to normal for some reason. Harry decides to go back to try to find Rose while leaving his daughter with a guy he spent all about 5 minutes in the same room with, and I wonder what the hell I'm doing with my life. Oh, and Travis shows up in a really blatant way, and we see the bus carrying Murphy from Downpour go into the town at the end because cameos! So that's what I hate about Silent Hill 3D in a nutshell. There really is more I could have mentioned, and I realize this isn't quite as well thought out as my list of things I hated about the first Silent Hill movie, but I feel like this movie doesn't deserve the effort. As for things I liked about the movie, they're pretty inconsequential. I liked Heather's outfit. No, seriously, it's actually an improvement over the one in the game. I'm sure some fans saw it and went, "It's got sleeves and tights, it's not supposed to have sleeves and tights, nah." Well, it actually makes a hell of a lot of sense. Silent Hill 3 had Heather running around in the fog and snow in a sleeveless top and a miniskirt. At least now she's covered. Also, I like how the jacket is fitted instead of being all puffy. The one from the game isn't really that flattering. Also, I thought Adelaide Clemens did a great job with what she was given. Why me? I don't think she bears a striking resemblance to Heather, as a lot of people seem to think, but that doesn't really bother me. I think it's kind of neat seeing a flashback of Harry killing the cult member that tried to attack them, which did happen in the continuity of the games, but we only read about it, we never actually got to see it. Harry used a gun instead of a knife, and Heather was a lot younger at the time, but this works just as well. I actually think the stabbing bit is kind of badass. Go Harry! I already mentioned that I like Douglas for all the difference it makes. And I also already mentioned that I thought Carrie Ann Moss did a really good job with what she was given for Claudia. And that's about it. Other than occasionally going, oh, that's kind of neat, there's nothing I really like about this movie. God, I hope I get to talk about the first Silent Hill game next year. Well, that's it for now. See you next time. Hey, this is Dina. Welcome to the den. Okay, before I get to the meat of this video, I better address the elephant in the room. I'm not sure why people would even want it at this point, but up until pretty recently I've been getting a lot of requests to do some kind of in-depth video about the Silent Hill quote-unquote playable teaser, or Silent Hills, the game that was going to be the next Silent Hill sequel that everyone was excited about, me included, until Konami cancelled it. I was never going to make a video about it before the finished game came out. For one thing, I don't even have a PS4, so I never even got a chance to play it for myself. And now that it's been taken down, I never will. I suppose I could have done some kind of commentary over someone else's playthrough of the teaser, but that would be kind of disingenuous since I didn't really experience it per se, I just watched someone else do it.
The only me is me. Are you sure the only you is you?
Also, again, the game has been cancelled. It sucks to be sure, and like the rest of you, I sure wish it wasn't, but I just kind of want to move on rather than dwell on it. So yeah, the most I can say about Silent Hills is that it looked amazing and I would like to have played it. If you're still interested in speculation about symbolism and story elements that it may have been hinting at, I recommend reading the TV Tropes page. There's actually a lot of that on there. We'll never know for sure if it's accurate, but whoever wrote this obviously put a lot of thought into it, and it's definitely worth a read. And I guess I can't go without also mentioning what's happening with Konami. When they cancelled Silent Hills, they mentioned that the Silent Hill series would continue in the same breath as mentioning they were veering away from video game production. Sounds like a contradiction. But then a commercial for the next Silent Hill game came out, which looked to be some kind of sequel or reimagining of Silent Hill 2. Ha, just kidding. It's a Silent Hill 2 themed pachinko machine, suckers.
The lever!
I'm sure we'd all like to hit the lever on Konami right about now.
Why do we even have that lever?
But yeah, that's all I have to say about that, other than it's not the best time to be a Silent Hill fan. I could rant about Konami and their horrible business practices and the firing of Hideo Kojima, but a lot of other video producers have done that already, and probably better than I ever could. I'll just say fuck Konami and leave it at that. Now that that's all out of the way, let's go back to a happier time. This is actually not the first video I've ever done on the original Silent Hill. Back in the days when I was just doing guest reviews for Still Gaming, I did one for Silent Hill. I was originally going to leave it at that, but eventually I decided to revisit it and give it similar attention as I've given the sequels. But I can't talk about how I discovered Silent Hill without talking about Resident Evil. Resident Evil was my introduction to survival horror, and I had never played anything like it until a friend introduced me to the Sega Saturn version of it. Even though I'm clearly showing the PlayStation version here. Remember, I grew up on the Atari 2600, and continued playing video games throughout the reign of Nintendo and Sega. During the time when I was just getting into horror movies and Stephen King novels, there weren't really any horror games to speak of. I know now that there were horror PC games, and the first Clock Tower game was on Super Famicom, but I didn't have access to things like that then. And I think the Genesis version of Splatterhouse somehow flew under my radar. Even just seeing blood in a game was a rare treat for me back then. And even though my interest in fighting games ended up not lasting very long, you gotta know that I jumped on Mortal Kombat pretty quick, as I've talked about in an earlier video. It was the closest thing I had to a horror game for a while. But Resident Evil was a lot of fun. It felt like a zombie or monster movie. Most of the scares were either jump scares, or squick, and it's notorious for its cheesy dialogue and voice acting.
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right! Even I'm guilty of making fun of it.
You guys are idiots.
That's the line of the game right there. You guys are idiots! But the graphics were beautiful for its time. It had a creepy, foreboding soundtrack and overall dark atmosphere. It basically achieved what it set out to do. But then the same friend told me about Silent Hill for the PlayStation, telling me that it was even scarier than Resident Evil. I played it, and the rest, as they say, is history. You play as Harry Mason, who has just been in a car accident on his way through a small town called Silent Hill. And that's at least the third time I've said that phrase in a video. He wakes up to find his 7-year-old daughter, Cheryl, missing, and the town appears to be completely deserted, other than a cop named Sybil Bennett and lots of monsters. And he meets a few other interesting characters on the way as he goes to hell and back to find his daughter, and a mystery slowly unravels itself. Gameplay-wise, it's pretty much run-of-the-mill survival horror. There are guns and various melee weapons. The gameplay is pretty straightforward. Despite being of the same genre, Silent Hill is a very different experience than Resident Evil. Instead of playing as a Special Forces officer, you play as basically just an average Joe, with very bad aim. Knowing what I now know about Team Silent, I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that that was probably intentional, since realistically, Harry's probably never fired a gun before. There are no bazookas or flamethrowers in this game, not that you don't get some nice weapons. The hunting rifle is probably the most powerful, just nothing of this caliber. It's not as pretty as Resident Evil, mostly because Resident Evil had pre-rendered backgrounds, while with Silent Hill the rendering is in real time, so graphics look more dated. That doesn't really matter though, the ambiance more than makes up for it, and the design is great even if the graphics don't support it as well as they could have. I think if anything, it works in its favor. Silent Hill isn't supposed to be pretty, and I feel like the dated graphics help to make it even more gritty somehow. I actually find the first Silent Hill game to have the creepiest and most disturbing atmosphere overall, and I think that might be why. While Silent Hill being cerebral is kind of a given now, at the time, it was the first game I had ever played that really messed with my head.
I don't remember this being here before.
It introduced the concept of the other world. Which became such a Silent Hill staple that I didn't even bother mentioning it when talking about the sequels.
Oh, hell.
I guess I just thought it was a given. Except I did bring it up when I talked about Origins, because that game lets you switch between worlds at will, which I didn't agree with. The only game to not use the other world concept is Silent Hill 4, as it was trying some new things, and instead of switching suddenly to the other world and back again at different points throughout the game, it was more like the world gradually became the other world the further you went into Walter Sullivan's subconscious. Which was an interesting way to do it, if not as Silent Hill-like. But in the first game, it packs such a punch. You think you're nearly done with an area, then suddenly you have to do it all over again in a much darker, more oppressive, and more intimidating environment with scarier monsters. In fact, the first game played up the idea of the worlds being alternate versions of each other in one scene that just totally blew my mind when I first played it. In the locker room at the school, one locker is rattling. You go to open it, and it turns out to be a cliché cat scare. After it shifts to the other world and you go back to that room, the locker is rattling again. But when you open it, it's empty other than being full of blood. And just as you're shaking your head, wondering if the cat exploded or something, and how it even got back in there to begin with, you're hit with a jump scare coming from somewhere else in the room. That whole aspect of repetition just really messed with my head. That weird feeling of deja vu with just enough differences to put you off is like something out of a nightmare. I'm not sure how to even explain it, but I think it's brilliant. And even though jump scares are overused these days, this one is so well timed and effective that it's actually a nice touch. Another thing that sets Silent Hill apart from Resident Evil is that it had lots of symbolism. You don't really need to know the symbolism to understand this particular story, as it's less complex than the other games, but it really helps to flesh things out. But Silent Hill does have one thing in common with Resident Evil: bad voice acting and dialogue.
Radio. What's going on with that radio?
What? What is this?
Although it's bad in a different way. While Resident Evil characters have this weird fake urgency going on in their speech, which kind of makes them sound like hyper kids.
Jill, you're here too.
Yes, you're here too?
We're all here! Silent Hill is almost the opposite, where there's too little emotion and urgency.
You from around here? Why don't you tell me what happened?
I don't mind it, actually. If anything, it gives an understated, creepy vibe, which I don't dislike. But there are lots of pauses in the speech.
I just got here. I don't know what happened.
Some of it obviously added in post-production, and that's kind of distracting.
For the 7 years since that terrible day, Alessa has been kept alive.
I think it might be a programming issue. Also, I don't think the voice acting is necessarily bad. It doesn't have that I'm acting feel to it.
Stop it! Don't open that door!
So much as the emotions the characters are trying to convey don't always work with what's going on in the scene, so that could be chalked up to bad direction. I mean, take the scene from the bad ending. It's technically a spoiler, but I'm showing it without context, and it's non-canon with Silent Hill 3 anyway. Harry's basically seeing his 7-year-old daughter die in front of him. And how does he react?
Cheryl?
Cheryl?
Cheryl!
Either way, this line just totally kills me.
Half the soul is lost. That is why the seed lies dormant.
The seed lies dormant. One good thing about Origins is that they took that scene and kept the dialogue intact, but it had better voice acting.
Half the soul is lost. The seed lies dormant.
But yeah, that's the only legitimate bad thing I have to say about Silent Hill. And I'm sure it has to do with the fact that the script was originally written by Japanese speakers and it got translated back and forth between Japanese and English a few times. I wouldn't care, except that it also resulted in the story being really hard to follow even as Silent Hill games go. To this day, I don't understand half of what Dahlia is talking about.
The path of the hermit concealed by flowers.
What? What are you talking about?
But anyway, I do definitely recommend this game, however dated it may look. In part 2, I'll talk more about the story and characters. As always, there will be spoilers, so if you haven't played the game yet, I am gonna miss you, Johnny Smith. Anyway, I recommend playing it before coming back for the next segments. So what sets Silent Hill apart from most of its sequels is that the main character is kind of incidental. The monsters in this game don't represent Harry, but Alessa, who I'm going to talk more about later. But first I'm going to start with the monsters. Meet Silent Hill Dog 1.0. The Groaners are basically very large, emaciated-looking, hairless, dog-like creatures with rotted brownish skin. There isn't a whole lot to say about them. They're a pain if you get too close, but they're easy to outrun. I'm sure they're inspired by Cerberus from Resident Evil. But in this case, they symbolize Alessa's fear of big dogs. Air Screamers are why there aren't too many flying enemies in Silent Hill games. They are irritating as fuck. But an Air Screamer is the first monster you see in this game after the radio is introduced. Appearance-wise, they're based on pterodactyls, only with a more human-like legs and torso. Apparently Alessa read Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's book The Lost World, and the pterodactyls really stuck with her. Also, the Groaners and Air Screamers each have an otherworld counterpart, with the main difference being that their heads are covered with worms, and their coloration is a bit different. I honestly didn't catch on to that for a very long time and thought it was just the same enemies who just looked a bit different in the darkness. The Grey Child is an interesting one, as it's only in the North American release. The Japanese and European versions replaced it with another creature called a Mumbler. It was thought that the Grey Children looked too, well, childlike according to the censors. In the North American release, the Mumblers are only seen in the second sewer area. Personally, I don't think the Grey Children look all that childlike, more like short humanoids in general, but whatever. Either way, they mostly show up in the school and they represent the children who are mean to Alessa. There's also a dark, translucent type called a Stalker that shows up late in the game. The Grey Child is also the only monster from the first game to show up in the movie. And they were generally handled well. I thought their burning up at the end was a nice touch. And then we have larval stalkers. Tiny, dark, and translucent. And harmless. They represent how Alessa felt, helpless and without an identity. Plus, they sometimes cling to Harry the way a scared child would cling to a parent. Also, look how cute they are! Come on! Come on! Oh, he fell down. In an earlier version, they were flesh-colored. I can't decide which is cuter. Naturally, with this being a Silent Hill game, there is a hospital along with nurses. And looking back, how refreshing is it that they don't represent sexual repression for once, and or aren't wearing skin-tight uniforms with their boobs half exposed? Not that I mind that as a one-shot thing, when appropriate for the respective character, but boy did it ever get repetitive after a while. Like the developers forgot that they could look any other way. Anyway, I have to say that the nurses really freaked me out the first time I saw this one in the game. They're zombie-like in a way, but they're not like the zombies in Resident Evil who just kind of aimlessly mill about in your general direction like something out of an old monster movie. When a nurse spots you, she comes right at you with a huge knife raised above her head. There's just something disturbingly realistic and intimidating about that. Also, when I first faced a nurse, I happened to have the steel pipe equipped, so I proceeded to beat her to death like I had been doing with previous enemies. With the other enemies, the only way you can tell that they're still alive is that you continue to hear static on the radio. The nurses, on the other hand, writhe around on the floor in agony. That was the most horrifying thing I had ever seen in a video game. At that point, I realized it was like 4 a.m., so I shut it off and went to bed, and I'm pretty sure I remember having a vague nightmare about it afterwards. Anyway, in this game they're generally hunched over with a kind of parasite growing out of their back, which is controlling them. And in this case they represent how the medical staff was being controlled by the cult. I'll explain what I mean by that later. Also, what sets this game apart from the others is that along with nurses, there are also doctors. They're about the same, really, aside from the obvious physical differences. In the streets you have to deal with rompers. I used to think they looked like thinner, long-legged bears, but they're actually humanoid creatures with brown skin like the dogs. They also appear to have a vertical mouth. Ew. They're also a complete pain in the ass because the second one spots me, it always knocks me down. Apparently they symbolize Alessa's dislike of adults due to how forceful and overbearing they are. Another enemy is the Split-Head boss, which is inspired by a creature in another book that Alessa read. It looks vaguely lizard-like, and its huge vertical mouth is its weak spot. Also, when you turn on the boiler in the school's basement, it makes the same noise as the monster, so whenever Alessa heard the boiler come on at school, she imagined it was the sound the monster from the story made. Also, there's a split worm boss in Silent Hill 3, which was a callback to Split-Head. This one obviously looks a lot more phallic. Most of the other creatures resemble various bugs and creepy crawlies that people tend to dislike. Giant cockroaches called creepers. The bloodsucker, which is made up of a trio of tentacles that resemble worms or snakes. The twin feeler boss, which is basically a giant poisonous caterpillar, which metamorphosizes into a giant moth called a float stinger. And in the sewers are hanged scratchers, which are insect-like with their long limbs that they climb with, but I always thought they looked reptilian due to their coloring. This could be a reference to dragons, since Alessa was into fairy tales. The final boss is officially referred to as Incubus, but is called God or Samael by Dahlia.
The Mark of Samael.
It's apparently based on a very old pagan fertility god called Baphomet. It has the head of a bull or a goat with a long pair of horns, the upper body of a woman, its midsection is missing other than the spine, and it has hooves and a set of wings. Yeah, it's very pagan looking. It basically looks the way Dahlia imagined it. The version we see in Silent Hill 3 is based on how Claudia imagined it with Alessa's face. It bursts out of Alessa and you have to kill it by dodging its lightning attacks and shooting it. As final bosses go, it's fairly easy to kill. If you're getting the bad ending, you actually fight Alessa, but the gameplay doesn't change. So the main character, as far as who you play as, is Harry Mason. The game starts off shortly after his wife has died, and his daughter Cheryl talks him into taking her to Silent Hill, which is where he has to swerve to avoid hitting a girl crossing the street, and crashes his vehicle. Cheryl is gone when he wakes up, so he spends pretty much the whole game trying to find her. Harry is not a super interesting character, but as I've said in other videos, I dig him anyway, at least as a concept. He lost his wife, and his daughter is pretty much all he has, so naturally he goes to hell and back for her.
Daddy? Help me. Daddy? Where are you?
Cheryl!
By the way, this bit where he slowly hangs up the phone gets to me every time. But anyway, I think that also affects how he reacts to the two women he meets in the town. He is really kind towards Lisa, and I like these moments where he finds her and they're all happy to see each other. It's kind of a nice break from all the horror. Also, when Sybil is injured late in the game, I'll explain that later, Harry takes care of her. Also, when I did that Still Gaming episode, I made a joke about this scene. The borderline sexism in this scene just kills me.
Wait. We don't know what's back there. I'd better check it out first.
I'm a cop. I should go.
Exactly.
No, I'm going.
No. Go into the kitchen and make me some pie. Which got me a lot of flack. First of all, obviously I was not being completely serious, but still I was trying to make a point that this scene has some unfortunate implications. Sybil is a cop. She's trained to handle disaster situations. Leather pants notwithstanding. What makes Harry, a writer, think that he's more capable of scoping out danger than she is? Well, it could simply be that being in this scary situation with a woman around subconsciously reminds him of the death of his wife. And that makes him a little uncomfortable, and he's overcompensating a bit, basically trying to protect her even though she shouldn't really need it in this case. The scene still makes me cringe a little, but mainly I just think it was handled badly. Sybil backing down doesn't help.
All right. I'll cover you from here.
A cop should be able to assert herself better than that. Not to mention that the very next conversation leads her to believe that Harry isn't in his right mind.
Do you know anything about... well, like some other world? It's like some kind of bad dream. It's like I was there, but not really. It's all a blur, like some kind of hallucination, you know?
Harry, you're tired.
But anyway, yeah, I don't actually think Harry is misogynistic or anything. That would go against the rest of his character. There isn't really a whole lot else to say about Harry Mason that I haven't already said in other videos. He's kind of the straight man surrounded by all this craziness. One of the reasons I love Shattered Memories is that it takes Harry and does some interesting things with him. A well-made Silent Hill movie could have done that, but we know how that turned out. I mentioned in my Silent Hill 3 video what his name was originally going to be, but I didn't do my homework, and so there was a certain nuance I didn't pick up on, so I'm going to mention it again and expand on it. According to the character commentary page in Book of Lost Memories, Harry was originally to be called Humbert after the main character in Lolita, but the English staff changed it because, quote, it was an uncommon name. How about the fact that they nearly named a devoted father figure after a child rapist? What the fuck, Japanese developers? Not to mention that Cheryl was to be named Dolores after the title character in Lolita, who is the victim of said rape. Seriously, what the hell?
Must be on drugs.
Although there is a blurb at the very end stating, I thought they're the same, but... which might be indicating that it was meant to be ironic since the two characters in Lolita were posing as a father and daughter, but weren't. Which I guess could also be said for Harry and Cheryl, since she isn't his biological daughter. So, I guess I kinda get it, but that still would have some pretty messed up connotations. Good lord, that would have been distracting. However it happened, I'm glad they didn't go that way. In any case, the actor who played Humbert in the Kubrick film was named James Mason, so Harry's last name most likely comes from that. I'm guessing that the protagonist in Silent Hill 2 being called James is coincidence, since everything I've read indicates that the name is a derivative of Joseph, which is linked to Jack the Ripper, but it's still kind of interesting. Speaking of actors, Harry was voiced by a voice actor who goes by Michael G, and aside from being known for saying this line...
Huh, radio. What's going on with that radio?
He apparently also said this line.
What is a man? A miserable little pile of secrets. But enough talk. Have at you!
He was also the announcer in Ridge Racer. Kind of ironic considering how Silent Hill starts out.
Look, Harry. I really don't get what's going on. But if there's a chance we can save your daughter, I'm in.
Sybil doesn't really do a whole lot in this game. She's mostly just there to help move the story along. She gives Harry a gun early on, which is a really odd thing for a cop to do, but whatever.
And don't go blasting me by mistake.
And every once in a while they just kind of touch base. It seems that she doesn't see any monsters or the other world, so she apparently isn't pulled into Alessa's nightmare as deeply as Harry is.
I have no idea what you're talking about, Harry.
Oh.
Late in the game, Sybil is infected by the same parasite inflicting the nurses in the hospital, and you have to choose to either kill her or use a substance on her called aglaphotis that expels the parasite. If you do save her but end up with a bad plus ending, she literally slaps some sense into Harry and helps him escape.
Harry. Go.
If you save her and end up with a good plus ending and save, the next time you see the opening, Sybil is shown replacing Harry's wife, implying that they got together. However, there is absolutely no evidence of Sybil in Silent Hill 3, and therefore no indication of what happened to her after the first game, or which of the two good endings is canon. There is a lot of speculation, and it seems that not all of the developers agree on it. But Book of Lost Memories states that the good ending is canon, meaning that Harry had to kill Sybil on the carousel. Which sucks because damn, it's brutal. The only reason I can think of for this is that it is stated in Silent Hill 3 that the little pill in Heather's locket, which was given to her by Harry, is made of aglaphotis, which is why when she takes it, the god fetus she was carrying is aborted, in a similar way that the parasite is expelled from Sybil. So I think the implication is that Harry doesn't use the aglaphotis on Sybil, therefore he holds onto it and has it made into the pill for Heather years later. I'm not saying that's necessarily true. In fact, my first assumption was that Harry just found more aglaphotis at some point to make the pill for Heather, and I didn't think to question it until I saw this brought up on a forum somewhere. But it is stated to be rare and extremely difficult to obtain, so maybe Harry not using it on Sybil was the only way to give some to Heather later on. Either way, Sybil's backstory is expanded on in the Silent Hill play novel. She eventually became a cop because she witnessed her parents being shot to death when she was a kid. Also, I'm gonna admit something. Despite her being really stupid in the end, Sybil is about the only character that I thought was mostly handled well in the movie. It probably helps that she didn't have a whole lot of characterization in the game, so there was less for them to screw up. Either way, she was a badass. But yeah, I admit it, I actually do like Sybil in the movie. Don't get me wrong, I like her in the game too. She has a kind of swagger and body language that suggests attitude, and I get a kick out of that. But she doesn't really have a whole lot of screen time, and stuff happens to her more often than she actually does stuff.
Harry, tell me what's happening here. Where is everybody? I must have gotten knocked out. When I came to, everyone was gone. It's awful.
Now, Lisa Garland, on the other hand, we do learn what happens to her, unfortunately. She had worked for Dr. Kaufman, who got her hooked on a drug and had her taking care of Alessa. I know I haven't gotten to Alessa yet, but for now, I'll just say that taking care of Alessa was not an easy task, and it took a toll on Lisa's sanity.
I can't stand it any longer. I won't tell a soul. Promise. So please.
She tried to quit, but Kaufman took away the drug, causing her to hallucinate. By the time Harry meets her, oh boy, is she ever broken. She is stuck in the hospital's otherworld, is suffering memory loss, and is horribly afraid.
Harry?
But once she goes into the basement, she begins remembering that she is the same as the parasitized nurses that had been attacking Harry.
Harry?
And remembering that triggers a transformation, resulting in a famous scene that is as heartbreaking as it is horrifying. Poor Lisa. Go easy on Harry, by the way. He's not enjoying locking her up. He's just trying to save himself so he can go find his daughter.
Lisa?
Lisa was named after Judy Garland, who of course played Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. There's kind of a parallel there in that Dorothy becomes lost in a dreamland, which is similar to what happens to Lisa, though hers is more of a nightmare. Lisa is voiced by Thessaly Lerner, who has actually been in a lot of stuff. Video game-wise, she's done a lot of voice work for The Sims, and she had a small part in Psychonauts.
She doesn't have time for an ugly little girl like you.
She's actually a great voice actor, which gives a bit more credibility to my theory that the voice actors in this game aren't necessarily bad, they were just given bad direction. As for Silent Hill 3, Lisa is clearly referenced at some points, but others are kind of controversial among fans. I didn't mention this in my Silent Hill 3 video because I thought it was just a rumor, so I ignored it. But over the years I've kind of changed my mind, so I'm going to bring it up here. And the words of Masahiro Ito seem kind of vague on this. Just before the shift to the otherworld in the hospital, the nurse Lisa, who appears in the first game, can be seen. The purpose of including this is to show that Alessa's influence on the otherworld grows stronger as she regains her memories. It indicates that even after the first game, she continues to suffer in the otherworld. Now, is he just talking about the videotape, which we see again at this point?
Why? What is keeping that child alive?
Because immediately after that, there are various pictures of Lisa's smiling mouth, and near said pictures is a bound female figure who is being made to suffer in some way, near Valtiel. It doesn't look like Lisa, but she is wearing a nurse hat. She also shows up again later, still in the hospital, in a similar situation, only Valtiel appears to be doing something to her behind some black smoke and is barely visible, though some fans have managed to hack it so that you can see it clearly. And no, Valtiel is not going down on her because he's facing the other way. Of course, she does resemble the Silent Hill 3 nurses that you have to fight, but the fact that she's always near images of Lisa, to me that seems to imply that it's meant to be Lisa. One could argue that he's referring to just the videotape, but then he goes on to say this. Although a nurse appears in a similar fashion in the church as well, this does not have anything to do with Lisa. So it sounds like he's saying that this is Lisa, but this is not. They do look different. And yes, I'm aware that this same character was also featured in the short film Fukuro. Saying that's not Lisa, that's Fukuro lady makes about as much sense as saying Pyramid Head doesn't represent James's need to punish himself in Silent Hill 2, that's just Fukuro guy. What I mean is that Fukuro is just a bunch of imagery with no context, so pointing out that something was also in Fukuro isn't really an argument against it being something in particular in the games. I do recommend watching it, by the way. It's like Silent Hill Monster Orgy the music video. It's only a couple minutes long and it's all over YouTube. Not to mention all kinds of fucked up.
Must be on drugs.
That said, I'm not necessarily saying that this is definitely Lisa. I'm just saying that I think that theory has some merit, and much as I'd like for Lisa to have some kind of happy ending, this just makes too much sense, all things considered. So, meet the person who is most to blame for everything that happens in this game, and pretty much the series. There were certainly other people involved as well, but Dahlia Gillespie was the mastermind behind all of it.
Herein lies the mother's womb, containing the power to create life.
She originally shows up in the Balkan Church spouting a bunch of nonsense, which she does a lot of in this game. A lot of it makes sense as you go along, but some of it doesn't. By the way, nice spelling error.
The time is now!
Believe it or not, she's supposed to be 46 when this game takes place. To help put that in perspective, I just turned 40, so she has seen some shit. When she was 32, she had a kid who, from very early on, showed signs of telekinetic powers, which reminded her of the dark god that her cult worshipped. So she figured her daughter Alessa would be a good vessel to birth their god. So she used a ritual of some kind to impregnate her. During the ritual, a fire was started which burned down the house with Alessa inside. There's an article you can find in the game stating that it was believed to have been caused by the malfunction of an antiquated boiler, but I think it's more likely a cover-up by the cult, and she was burned intentionally as part of the ritual. Yeah, Dahlia's about the nastiest antagonist in the series, alongside Dr. Kaufman. She does eventually get at least a smidge of what's coming to her in the end. She also helped to set the events of Silent Hill 4 in motion, since apparently she was the one who told Walter Sullivan that he could wake his mother by completing the 21 sacraments. Apparently this was to be a backup plan in case things didn't work out with Alessa. Dahlia was named after a former girlfriend of horror film director Dario Argento, whose name was actually Daria, whoops. Her last name may have come from a character in Stephen King's Salem's Lot. But Dahlia did not work alone. Dr. Michael Kaufman had ties with the cult. Alessa survived being burned and was kept alive for 7 years with a combination of magic and medicine. Kaufman kept her in the basement of Alchemilla Hospital and forced Lisa Garland to care for her, and then he basically didn't allow her to quit. Kaufman isn't really that interesting. I mean, it's shocking to learn that he's a doctor and he's using that medical knowledge in such a messed up way. Oh, what the hell. There's just something so unsettling about a deranged doctor. Something about all that knowledge of human anatomy being put in the wrong hands. Not totally appropriate, but I never get tired of referencing Dr. Faustus. Anyway, other than his part in the game's backstory, he's not that interesting. This is actually the only case where I preferred the version of the character that was in Origins.
Try harder.
He had a quiet creepiness to him that I totally dug.
Time to put her pawn to sleep. Good night.
Here he just sounds kind of cold and proper.
Did you see those monsters? Have you ever seen such aberrations? Ever even heard of such things?
He's always in this perpetual state of urgency, though, which amuses me for some reason.
I can't just sit around here doing nothing. This isn't the time to stand around flapping our gums. You shouldn't be hanging around here goofing off.
Until he gets really mad and then he starts sounding like the shop teacher from South Park.
Quit screwing around.
Hey, don't screw around. You screw around too much.
And he's even more trigger-happy than Richard Braintree. At least he didn't actually shoot at Henry. Either way, he's a total scumbag and definitely gets what's coming to him at the end. Dr. Michael Kaufman's name is an amalgam of the names of two producers from Troma Studios. Also, Kaufman in German means seller, dealer, or businessman, which references both his drug dealing and his businessman-like appearance. Oh, good Lord, Alessa. Even before the ritual, she had a rough time of it. Not only did the kids at school bully her, but it's hinted at that she was also abused by Dahlia. According to one of her teachers, her expression was, quote, pitifully dark for a 6-year-old. And then the ritual happened, leaving her in excruciating pain for 7 years as she suffered from third-degree burns all over and impregnated with a god that she couldn't deliver, so it ate away at her from the inside, causing not only pain but horrible nightmares for 7 years. Needless to say, she went insane and essentially lashed out, her powers awakening the negative energy already present in the town from all the tragedies that had happened in the past, causing those nightmares to manifest themselves. Screw it. Silent Hill 2 actually expands on those past tragedies a lot. She had also split her soul in two, the second part manifesting itself as a baby that was found on the side of the road by Harry Mason and his wife, who they adopted and named Cheryl. She lived as a normal, happy kid, which is what Alessa wanted, for at least part of her to be happy for a while. But after 7 years of suffering, Alessa wanted to end it, so she summoned her other half, Cheryl, so they could become one again and Alessa could end her life. But that was also what Dahlia wanted, because God could not be born unless Alessa was whole. Alessa and Cheryl do re-merge and end up under Dahlia's control. In the good endings, Dr. Kaufman throws Aglaophotis on Alessa, causing God, or the incubus, to emerge from her prematurely. Once Incubus is killed, Alessa dies as well, but not before reincarnating her whole self as a baby, which she gives to Harry. I think once she merged with Cheryl, she gained some of her memories, and she recognizes Harry as the loving father figure she didn't have as Alessa, and she wants to experience that herself. Of course, that baby grows up to be Heather, and see my videos on Silent Hill 3 to see the rest of that story. One thing I'm pretty sure I didn't touch on in those videos, though, is that Alessa does show up in Silent Hill 3 in the form of a boss. She tries to kill Heather to spare her and others from further pain after God is born. Afterwards, Heather remarks that she doesn't really consider her and Alessa to be the same being since they don't think alike, despite that she has regained Alessa's memories. But yeah, it sucks to be Alessa. One thing I didn't like about both the movie and Origins is that they painted Alessa as spiteful and malevolent. Especially in the movie where she goes on a bloody murderous rampage with barbed wire tentacles. Granted, maybe that works with the movie's story, which involves an entire town of people turning on a 7-year-old for no reason. I'd be pretty pissed off about that too. But it was still over the top and ridiculous in my opinion, especially since I didn't even like the story leading up to that point. Anyway, while she certainly has reason to be angry and vengeful, I never saw her that way in the first game. And that's actually part of what I liked about her. She does become a little more aggressive towards Harry as the story progresses, but really she's just trying to slow him down because she doesn't want him to reach Cheryl. In the game, she's mostly focused on reaching her goal, which is rejoining with Cheryl and ending her life. That's all she cares about at this point. But she comes across as mostly benevolent in the game, which I liked because it's the less obvious way to go, rather than the scorned victim bent on revenge trope that we've seen in a million other things. Interestingly, Stephen King's Carrie is cited as part of the inspiration for this story, which is infamous for its bloody revenge scene. But I feel that Silent Hill focuses more on the girl with telekinetic powers who is tormented by her peers and an abusive religious fanatic mother aspect rather than the revenge aspect. Maybe that's just me, but that's how I saw Alessa when I played the first game, and so I was disappointed to see the movie in Origins take it in another and more obvious direction. Alessa was going to be named Asia after Dario Argento's daughter, but they didn't go with that, apparently because it's a, quote, uncommon name. I'd say Alessa is less common if anything, but whatever. Her name in Italian means Defender of Mankind, which is a fitting name for Dahlia to give her since she wanted her to birth God, which was supposed to result in bringing paradise. It could also be a reference to Alessa's preventing God from being born. Here's something I totally missed when I covered Silent Hill 4, because I honestly never even caught it while playing the game. The image on the Saint Medallion, the item that protects Henry from ghosts, has the same image of Saint Alessa that appears in a painting in Silent Hill 3. Considering how often I hear fans say that Silent Hill 2 and 4 don't necessarily take place in the same universe as 1 and 3, Silent Hill 4 sure references the first game a lot. So that's Silent Hill, the game that started it all. It was surprisingly hard to talk about, and I know this episode is relatively brief compared to my previous Silent Hill videos. I guess because for a long time I didn't think I was even going to make this video, so I ended up talking about the first game a lot when covering the sequels, so there wasn't much left after that. But yeah, this game was revolutionary for its time. Often imitated, never duplicated, as they say. Probably just about any game these days that has a dark and cerebral bent to it could be traced back to Silent Hill for at least part of its inspiration. Speaking of inspiration, I figured this would be a good time to talk about the sources that Silent Hill drew inspiration from that I haven't already mentioned. Aside from Carrie, there's also The Mist. I don't think I have to explain that one. Insert usual comment about how I still haven't seen this one, but I need to. An obvious one is Jacob's Ladder, which is really inspiration for the whole series to varying degrees. In the first, it's mostly that the wheelchair with a spinning wheel is similar to a bike with a spinning wheel. Then there's the fact that, how can I put this without spoiling anything? One of Silent Hill's endings borrows heavily from the movie's ending. Apparently the Gillespie house is modeled after a painting called Christina's World. The house in that painting depicts a real one, the Olsen house, which is in Maine, which is most likely where Silent Hill is meant to be. Also, the girl depicted in this painting suffers from paralysis, which could be seen as similar to how Alessa couldn't get out of bed for 7 years. And of course there are lots of references to classic children's books since Alessa was a reader. Alice in Wonderland with a puzzle involving plates depicting various characters. Then of course there's a Wizard of Oz with Lisa's last name and a puzzle that involves collecting 3 keys that reference the characters. The various locked doors in Nowhere that are labeled Aratron, Bethor, Haggith, Ophiel, and Phalag are named after 5 of the 7 Olympian spirits mentioned in several Renaissance and post-Renaissance books of ritual and ceremonial magic. And this one is totally random, but apparently Midwich Elementary School is modeled after the school from Kindergarten Cop. Yeah. The list is actually pretty long. I mostly just picked out things I was at least partly familiar with, along with a few things that were just too interesting to leave out. Well guys, I guess that's about all I have to say about Silent Hill. Despite the fact that it looks dated and has a few flaws like the voice work, it's definitely worth playing, if only for its significance and how it helped shape how horror was handled in video games. This feels kind of like the end of another era. I have now covered all Silent Hill games that I have been able to play, and of course both movies. And frankly, with how things are going with Konami right now, I don't have too much confidence that more games are going to get made. Silent Hill themed pachinko machines notwithstanding. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm done making Silent Hill related videos. There's also Silent Hill Arcade, which isn't really my cup of tea as far as gameplay goes, and it's mostly fan service as far as monster designs. But it does reference some of Silent Hill's history as it was established in earlier games, so I think it's worth talking about in that regard. Also, while not an official game, Silent Hill Alchemilla looks like it's worth playing and possibly talking about. I have not played it yet, but I plan to. And if the stars align themselves just right, maybe I'll find a way to check out some sort of translation of the Silent Hill play novel. I've always been interested in that one because it has a lot of little side stories and more endings. And there are also little cell phone games and such that are Japan exclusive. If I can dig up some info on those, that could be a subject for a video. And who knows, maybe Konami will sell off the franchise to some other company and more Silent Hill games will eventually get made. And even if they don't, I can always do editorials that touch on specific themes in the series and stuff like that. For the most part, Silent Hill has been really good to me, and I'm not ready to cast it aside just yet, even if I only have a limited number of games to reference. And even though I don't consider this the end of my Silent Hill videos, I still get a certain feeling of finality with this one. So while I'm at it, I want to thank everyone who has kept up with all these videos. Sometimes it's been a serious pain trying to get these episodes done in time for October, hence why I had to settle for putting out a brief video about one of the movies a couple times, but I like that Silent Hill in October ended up being kind of a tradition. Sometimes it was practically the only video I did that year, so if nothing else it encouraged me to continue making videos even if I had to start a few months early and power through overtime at work and other life stuff that got in the way. If nothing else, I would always get some kind of Silent Hill video done for you guys that year. Also, I learned a lot about the games while looking up info for these videos. How else was I going to find out that James was named after Jack the Ripper and that Silent Hill 4 was inspired by a weird book called Coin Locker Babies? And of course, there's also all the cool people I've had the chance to get in touch with who I wouldn't have otherwise. While I love hearing from people that I help them get into Silent Hill with my videos, I got more into Silent Hill myself while making the videos for you guys, so in a way it's a two-way street. But I just want to say thank you for sticking with me so far. But I'm not done yet, so I hope you'll continue to stick around as I find more Silent Hill related things to talk about. That's it for now. See you next time.
This town is full of monsters. How can you sit there and eat pizza?
Monsters? They look like monsters to you?
Must be on drugs.
What the hell? You gotta be shitting me.
This is Dina. Wow, it's been a while since I did a Silent Hill video, and after this one you'll know why. I kid, most of the people who post in the comments section are cool. But with how Silent Hill games basically encourage the players to analyze them, there's the occasional person who has a weird pet theory that they can't back up and they still refuse to let go of it. In some cases, there is literally straightforward evidence in the game to prove that they're wrong. And that's basically what this video is. I'll be taking 5 fan theories and doing my best to debunk them based on information in the game or in some cases lack thereof. These aren't necessarily popular theories, but they're ones I've heard at least a couple times that rubbed me the wrong way for some reason. For the record, there's no reason why you're not allowed to have your own headcanon. I'm not trying to police your imagination or anything. What gets my dander up is when people treat their pet theories as fact and get into arguments with people over some faux facts that they basically made up. But I'm going to avoid theories that are open-ended and could really go either way. I once got into it with a guy because he took Douglas's offhand comment about having been to Silent Hill on a missing persons case to mean that he was looking for James Sunderland.
You've been there?
Once. On a missing persons case. Never did find him.
I honestly think that the developers put that in to explain why Douglas knows how to get to Silent Hill and add a little exposition about what kind of place it is.
That's one screwed up town.
With him already being a private investigator, just adding that he had to look for someone there once is a really easy way to do that. Douglas doesn't say anything about the person except that it was a man who he never found. It could have just as easily been Dr. Kaufman or Eddie or even someone not mentioned in any games. I mean, the very nature of Silent Hill is that when people go there, they don't always make it out. And my point was just that it doesn't have to be James. And he acted like, of course it was James, and it was silly of me to even question it. But in that case, there's nothing to say that it isn't James either, so that's not the sort of theory I'll be talking about. However, this guy is a good example of the sort of Silent Hill fan that gets on my nerves. Speaking of things that get on my nerves, here's a fan theory that isn't really a theory so much as basically just a mistake that kind of grew into a common misconception. I feel like this one has kind of faded into obscurity, but since it's come up in my videos so many times that not mentioning it would be ignoring the elephant in the room, we'll call it an honorable mention.
He was in a car accident, and he woke up to find that his daughter was missing. And now he has to trudge through this deserted town in the snow and—
It's not snow, it's ash! I literally cannot say it in any other voice. Basically what happened is that the movie, which is a loose adaptation of the first game at best, has a bit where Rose, right after waking up in Silent Hill, sees what looks like snow and then realizes it's ash coming down from the sky. And I didn't mind that, actually. It's okay for an adaptation to have unique little details like that to set it apart from the source material a little. But what seemed to happen is that casual fans of the games maybe assumed that the game developers were involved somehow and the movie was expanding on the game's universe, or more likely it was just a Mandela effect where they just thought they remembered it also being that way in the games. However it happened, I had to put up with people correcting me on that for a while. There's no reason to think that it's anything other than regular snow in the game. The only time it's mentioned is when Kaufman comments that it's an odd time of year for it to be snowing.
And it's snowing out this time of year.
I mean, I guess you could apply some mental gymnastics to that to indicate that he's implying that it's not really snow, but however subtle Silent Hill can be, I really think they would have acknowledged it more clearly than that. Like, I really think Harry would have noticed early on that the snow didn't feel cold, and he would have made some kind of observation about it. I actually thought this one died down until Shattered Memories came out and someone complained about the game mistakenly having snow when the original had ash. So who knows, maybe it's still out there, but I've just been lucky enough to not have to hear about it over the last couple years. If nothing else, hopefully Shattered Memories has caused a Mandela effect of its own to correct what the movie did. So yeah, I know I've talked about that one before, but I don't think I ever officially addressed it. However, it's such a classic that I still occasionally joke about it.
When's the snow supposed to stop?
If I'd seen the forecast, I wouldn't be here.
That's
I'd be watching TV from
and get teased by my colleagues. So without further ado, here's my top 5 list of Silent Hill fan theories that are wrong.
Number 5.
Silent Hill 4 is a random game that has nothing to do with Silent Hill. They just slapped the name on it at the last minute because Konami didn't think it would sell otherwise, and that's why it sucks and isn't a real Silent Hill game.
What the hell?
Yep. 13 years after Silent Hill 4 came out, people still think this, still complain about it, and still use it as an excuse to hate the game. What happened is that the developers, in an early interview, made the mistake of mentioning as a kind of fun fact that when they first came up with the idea of Silent Hill 4, they were going to call it Room 302 and it was going to be a spin-off of the series. And fans just kind of took this and ran away with it. The thing is, by the time they'd gotten to the 4th installment of the series, the games were beginning to stagnate, and the developers felt that Silent Hill 4 was a good time to try some new things. Some of those things worked and some didn't, but fans didn't like the changes and just kind of fabricated this story about how this was just some random game that Konami slapped the Silent Hill name onto because they didn't think anyone would want to play it otherwise.
Oh, that's just stupid.
Hell, when I did my Game Den episode on Silent Hill 4, I did as much digging as I could and could find no info about what the game was supposedly like before the name change, so I theorized that it must have happened very early in development. Well, since then, more info has come out to further that point. More interviews with the developers have resurfaced where they talk about wanting to change the series. These are not things that people making an entirely different game would say, so I think it's pretty clear that the game was probably still in the planning stages when they decided it would be a Silent Hill game. The reason the game is different from the previous ones is not because it started off as something else. If anything, it was the opposite. They wanted to take this existing franchise and try different things with it. It's fine if you don't like Silent Hill 4. I know it's flawed, and I talked about those flaws in the Game Den video I did on it. So I'm not saying that you aren't allowed to dislike it, but at least hate it for legitimate reasons, and please stop perpetuating this bullshit myth.
Number 4.
Alex Shepard is gay.
You gotta be shitting me.
Now, I do get why theories like this pop up, even not taking yaoi lovers into account. There really isn't a lot of LGBTQ+ representation in media in general, let alone video games. So I think some people try to see it when it isn't there because they want to. This one is on Homecoming's Wild Mass Guessing page on TV Tropes, which already makes me take it with a grain of salt, because it also says Alex is the soldier from Team Fortress 2, and the whole series was Alex making up stories to entertain Josh. But I've heard it mentioned outside of there too, so for the kind of theory it is, I think it's fairly popular. Some reasons given are the fact that there are no pictures of him on the walls, his dad is heard telling his brother not to be like him. It basically comes down to his parents don't accept him because he's gay. And that just doesn't really go with the rest of the story. Alex's parents treated him badly because they had chosen him to be sacrificed, possibly even before he was born. It's like how farmers don't treat their livestock as pets. It's going to be a lot harder to kill something if you've grown attached to it. So they made it a point not to get attached to Alex, and were downright mean to him. Kept him out of the family pictures and tried to turn Josh against him at one point. In fact, it makes sense that they'd want Josh to hate him too, because that'd make his sacrifice easier on Josh. Hell, they even convinced themselves that it was also for Alex's benefit. Like if he'd had a shitty life, he'd welcome death.
I had to make sure that he would never feel joy or compassion. All the things that make life worth living. You must understand, I was only trying to make things easier for him.
Which is kind of bullshit, but it's a good example of how people can convince themselves of whatever they need to help them sleep at night. I know some people don't like the twist at the end and think that if they were gonna kill one of their kids, they'd be extra nice to the kid until then to make up for it, so Josh being the sacrifice makes more sense. And that would be poetic and all, but not very realistic. It just makes more sense that they're going to pick the method that's easier on themselves, relatively speaking, of course.
Killing a person ain't no big deal.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's like that. But anyway, I got a bit off track there. We've already got all the explanation we need for Alex's parents to treat him poorly and act like he doesn't exist. Piling, oh, and they also didn't like that he's gay, on top of that would just kind of overcomplicate things. One guy also pointed out that smog is colorful, like a gay pride flag. It is unusually colorful for a Silent Hill monster, but that's pushing it. I think the developers just wanted it to stand out a bit in the fog in an interesting way. And think of a Silent Hill game where trying to show homosexuality through monster designs. The monsters would be predominantly phallic-shaped. Someone claims that the Schism's head looks like a penis. Whoever's penis you're basing that on should probably see a doctor. I mean, maybe the neck part looks kinda like a shaft, but the head is clearly meant to look like a pendulum, and when a heavy head is meant to hang down from a long neck, there's only so many ways the neck could look. I'm gonna call it coincidence. Besides, we've got sexy faceless nurses in this game, and we all know that's become Silent Hill code for "this man likes titties." So I mean, if it makes you feel better to think that Alex is gay, go nuts, I guess. Just don't try to argue that it's canon.
Number 3.
Pyramid Head isn't raping those monsters, that's just made up by perverted Americans.
Have you gone nuts?
To be fair, the perverted Americans bit was said by one person in one instance, but I just thought it was too funny to leave out. I mean, I'm not gonna get into a debate with anyone about which culture is more perverted because whoever wins, we lose. But let's not pretend that the Japanese are pure as the driven snow either, okay? But honestly, while the majority of the fandom accepts, and even sometimes disturbingly embraces, what's going on in these two scenes as rape, there's a small group of fans who pop up once in a while and just flat out deny it. This isn't really a theory so much as an argument I've seen people make. But for the record, I can understand not picking up on it at first, because I didn't. I mean, it is kind of vague looking, like you can see a lack of penetration here, and in the second scene, Pyramid Head's helmet is in the way, and it's hard to tell what's going on. But anyway, when I first played the game, my mind just didn't go there. It wasn't until I read about it and went back and looked again and went, oh wow, that is what's happening. That's fucked up. I will also admit that I couldn't find any confirmation that this was definitely what the developers were going for, as in no interviews with them where that specific thing comes up. But Translated Memories does basically admit it. Mannequins are described as, quote, a manifestation of James's natural urges and inclinations. Accordingly, it's abused by Pyramid Head. Now, they don't literally say rape there, but you're talking about a symbol of sexual urges and mentioning abuse because of that. I think they are saying that, but they're just being very delicate about the wording. I mean, let's look at the evidence. Pyramid Head symbolizes James's guilt. One thing James feels guilty about is the sexual frustration he felt while his wife was sick, and how he probably had very unclean thoughts about other women. One of those things symbolizing those other women are mannequins. So that explains this scene. And I know it's vague looking, but I think they either did it that way because they wanted to not be too obvious about it, or maybe it was the only way to get it past the censors. I mean, their crotches line up and the mannequin is gyrating. Clearly this is meant to be sexual, at least in a symbolic way. In the case of lying figures, they represent sickness and therefore could be symbolizing Mary. Or with the straitjacket appearance, they could also symbolize James's mental anguish. If you go with the first one, again, this scene makes sense. Maybe this is meant to show that James thought about better times with his wife and simultaneously felt bad about thinking of her in that way while she was suffering. I know it's hard to see what's happening with the helmet being in the way. I thought it was pretty obvious that he was forcing this lying figure to go down on him. But looking again, I'm not sure it's really that obvious, since we can't see where the lying figure's head is. Either way, Pyramid Head is clearly grinding against it, and a pretty orgasmic moan is heard. So again, there's definitely something sexual going on.
Looks like somebody has specific taste in entertainment.
Besides, it's not like sexual imagery is out of place in this game. Aside from the mannequins and nurses, both times Pyramid Head kills Maria on screen, he impales her with a spear, so that could be symbolic of penetration. And hell, have you seen Fukuro? Don't even tell me this isn't meant to be sexual. Then again, I guess it could all be in my head. Me being a perverted American and all. That's never gonna get old. In the end, though, I think the main reason this tickles me is the idea that someone would want to defend the virtue of this guy. How dare you accuse this man of sexual misconduct, good sir? He is indeed an upstanding citizen.
Number 2.
Laura isn't real, she's Mary's other alter ego.
Huh? Are you blind or something?
Yeah, I know there were 2 Silent Hill 2 theories in a row, sorry about that. I'm kind of putting these in the order of which ones bother me the most, and the Pyramid Head one bothered me more than the Alex one, and trust me, this one had to be number 2. This one is a bit personal along the lines of, it's ass, because this is one where people tried to correct me and were really obnoxious about it. When I first uploaded my Game Den episodes on Silent Hill 2 to Channel Awesome back in the day when it was thatguywiththeglasses.com, someone posted a comment screaming at me for not including this, and another person agreed with them. How could you not mention that Laura is the other half of Mary's personality and symbolizes her innocence? And then they accused me of not knowing enough about Silent Hill and chastised me for not reading the Silent Hill wiki. Silly me, I had only been looking at a translation of the Book of Lost Memories, the official Bible of the first 3 Silent Hill games. What the fuck did I know, right? By the way, just to double check, I looked over Laura's page on the Silent Hill wiki a little while ago, and that's not mentioned on there anywhere, not even as a theory. At least not now, maybe it was there at the time and got deleted at some point. That kind of thing can happen on the Silent Hill wiki. But seriously, my reaction to that was, what? I had never heard that before in my life, and the game literally disproves it. At first I thought it was just those 2 people, but then years later someone asked me if Laura was real. So I guess it is one of those theories that just kind of got around. I mean, all you have to do is watch the game's trailer in the beginning. Along with the clips of the cutscenes in the games, it shows a little more. We see Laura visiting Mary in the hospital, and we see Laura bumming a ride to Silent Hill from Eddie. We are literally shown that Laura's story about meeting Mary in the hospital is legit, and if you wondered how she got to Silent Hill, we're shown that too. I could just stop there. I mean, the game practically spells it out. There you go. But let's play devil's advocate for a minute. Let's say the developers put those scenes in to throw us off the scent or something. I don't know why they would, but whatever. The only reason I can think of is that it is kind of weird that Laura keeps getting ahead of James despite his obstacles. Even the hotel where James had to get there by boat. Like, how did Laura get there? I can think of a couple responses to that. One is just video game logic. I know we love to dig really deep into every aspect of a Silent Hill game, but it is still a game at the end of the day, and real-world logic doesn't have to apply in every case. And if that explanation feels like a cop-out, 2 is, James is seeing his own personal version of Silent Hill with dead bodies and monsters, and that's what we're seeing. But when James mentions the monsters to Laura, she doesn't know what he's talking about. This is because she doesn't see the monsters. Meaning that she's seeing a different, non-corrupted version of Silent Hill. Maybe she doesn't experience any of the roadblocks that James does. Maybe to her, there's a bridge leading to the hotel. We don't know, but ultimately it doesn't matter. It's just a detail. Also, if the developers wanted us to think that Maria and Laura are 2 sides of the same coin, why would they treat them so differently? Maria is completely mysterious and doesn't tell James anything other than her name.
I don't look like a ghost, do I?
He doesn't figure out what she really is until the 3rd time she gets killed. Laura doesn't tell James everything right away.
You didn't love Mary anyway.
But she does reveal that she knew Mary, and even tells him where they met.
I was friends with Mary. We met at the hospital. It was last year.
And relays a lot of what Mary said to her.
Me and Mary talked a lot about Silent Hill. She even showed me all her pictures. She really wanted to come back. That's why I'm here.
And she mentions how old she is.
I turned 8 last week.
And again, we know how she got to Silent Hill. And speaking of the 2 characters being handled differently, have you ever noticed that it's kind of hinted at that only James can see Maria? It took me a while to pick up on this, but notice that Maria tends to make herself scarce right before James runs into someone. In the hospital, she gets sick and has to lay down while James goes on without her for a while, and this happens shortly before James interacts with Laura. In that bit where James is about to go into a bowling alley and this exchange happens...
I'll wait here. I hate bowling.
I didn't come here to play, you know.
Hurry back.
It's not just Maria being comically assholish, though it is funny in one of my favorite lines from the game. If she goes into the bowling alley and Eddie can see that James has an invisible friend, that's going to break the illusion for James. And after that...
Did a little girl run out of here?
Yeah, She was too fast for me.
Isn't it interesting that Maria has to run after Laura and she ends up getting away? Presumably Maria called out to her, but Laura just kept running. Isn't that kind of an odd thing for Laura to do? She came to Silent Hill to find Mary, and then someone who looks and sounds just like Mary calls out to her and Laura runs away from her? Kind of hints at the fact that Maria doesn't exist for Laura. However, in contrast, Laura is seen and heard conversing with Eddie in the bowling alley.
You're just a gutless fatso.
So yeah, Laura is a normal person. She was not created by the town.
Number 1.
So here you go. If you did not already know about this one, you're gonna love it. So this one is kind of an odd duck, since I'm mostly covering fan theories that are at least somewhat popular, and this one was said by one person and pretty much nobody agreed with it, but boy is it ever a doozy. So even though it kinda doesn't go with the others, there's just no way I could leave out the Great Circumcision War of 2015. So basically, in December of 2015, a mod over on the Silent Hill wiki decided that Walter Sullivan had been circumcised, and so he edited the Walter Sullivan page so that it now had walls of text expressing anti-circumcision propaganda, with proof such as bloody forceps on a stretcher, phallic symbolism, syringes and pills, a restrained figure, and this is apparently a really big torso-shaped foreskin.
Whatever.
As I'm sure you can tell by my tone, I don't buy any of this. Forceps, stretchers, and syringes are in nearly all of the Silent Hill games because these are things you find in a fucking hospital. And while the white stools do look kind of phallic, it's toadstools being shown here, but either way, I think they really are just meant to be fungus to show how damp and gross the water prison was. And if they symbolize anything else, it's probably umbilical cords with a fetus attached. As for the greedy worm symbolizing a monstrous penis, do I really need to explain that it's meant to symbolize an umbilical cord? I mean, it's right there in the name. An umbilical cord is basically a feeding tube, hence greedy, as in wanting food. And literally anything he points out about Walter Sullivan's behavior that is supposed to be attributed to the trauma of having been circumcised could just as easily be attributed to the trauma of abandonment and abuse in general. So, to call any of this proof of circumcision symbolism is really a stretch. Also, circumcision isn't really a thing in Japan where Silent Hill 4 was made, so I'm not saying they couldn't have an opinion on it, but it's not part of their culture and therefore not something that they really have to deal with on a personal level, so I don't see them making a huge statement about it like he's claiming. Also, Walter Sullivan was abandoned in his parents' apartment, so who was supposed to have told the hospital to perform a circumcision? Like, did Frank Sunderland just randomly hand them $200 and ask them to circumcise a kid that wasn't his and that he'd never see again? Would the hospital even allow that from someone who wasn't a parent? Maybe the umbilical cord wasn't the only thing he kept. And like I said when I talked about the theory of Alex Shepard being gay, piling on that extra layer of, oh, and also he was circumcised, would just complicate things and take away from the main point. Anytime someone called him out on any of this, he'd go on a rant about how they're horrible for advocating circumcision, even though all any of them said is that it doesn't belong on a Silent Hill 4 wiki. Also that they were a bunch of brainwashed sheep that needed to wake up. And anytime someone else would try to edit the page, he'd change it back and block them. Oh, did I only mention that he was a mod? He was also an administrator, so he had the ability to block anyone from editing the page, even the other mods. And he did. I have no idea what was going through this guy's head, other than he's really passionate about circumcision to the point of it being an unhealthy obsession. Like, did he really think that this was gonna fly with people? Because the best way to get people to agree with your opinion is to scream it as loud as you can in as many places as possible? I wonder if he even believes that Silent Hill 4 has anything to do with circumcision, or if he just made up all these connections to just have a place to spew all of his propaganda. I mean, I'm against declawing cats, but you don't see me editing the wiki to say that the cat in Henry's fridge symbolizes a cat he had when he was little and his parents got declawed, and the mournful meowing the cat made symbolizes its pain at having to dig in the litter box afterwards because of the evils of humanity. This is something that the Japanese totally care about, and if you disagree with that theory, you hate animals, blah blah blah, wake up you sheep. But yeah, I normally try to avoid internet drama, but this was a train wreck that I could not look away from. The guy eventually expanded his ranting about circumcision to the Illuminati being behind it for some reason, and Christianity is secretly about Satan worshipping, like the rabbit hole just kept getting deeper and deeper. I'm not going to go into too much more detail because it got all over the internet and it's really easy to find info on it. I'll link to a site that basically told the whole story through a series of tweets someone made, which is loaded with screenshots, some of which I used here. But my favorite part was when someone shared this with Jeremy Blaustein, who is the translator and localization coordinator of Silent Hill 2 through 4, and he responded, "What the fuck?" And then later added, "I can only conclude that he thought an umbilicus meant a foreskin." By the way, it wasn't just Silent Hill 4. He also added circumcision to Alex Shepard's origin, because of course his parents are going to blow $200 on unnecessary surgery for a kid they plan on sacrificing later. And it wasn't just Silent Hill in general either. Apparently Xenosaga is also all about circumcision. So what ended up happening was that because he was an administrator, they had to hold a poll asking for everyone with an account to weigh in on whether they were in favor of or opposed to having him remain an administrator. So I made an account just to post my 2 cents. The first and so far the only time I ever posted to that community. He did end up getting blocked, but apparently he was allowed back in with only mod status about 3 months later. Take that info how you want. Well, there you go. 5 fan theories fully debunked, whether they needed to be or not. And if you're one of the people who believed one of the above theories or even posted it, I hope you didn't take any of this personally. The main reason I didn't dig up screenshots of the specific comments, with the exception of number 1 of course, but that's a special case, is because the point is to not make this personal or call anyone out and just focus on the theories themselves. Yes, I am passionate about some of these and I probably sound angry and frustrated, and clearly I had some fun with this, but again, it's nothing personal. If anything, it's a major berserk button for me when misinformation gets spread and it tends to set me off. You can imagine how often I get angry on Tumblr. But it's the action that bothers me. 9 times out of 10 I didn't even remember who said it, only that it was said. So this was my first Silent Hill video that was not a retrospective of a specific game. Well, other than that end of an era video I did, but that was an intro to the post-Team Silent games. I have other list videos in mind, along with some editorial type videos, but if there's anything in particular about the Silent Hill series you'd like me to talk about, let me know in the comments. That's it for now. See you next time. As I was editing this video, I noticed he's been blocked again. Maybe by the time you see this, he'll go back to being unblocked. Who knows?
Must be on drugs.